Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop, and settle in wherever you happen to be tonight. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere else you need to be for the next few hours. Tonight we are not standing on the customer's side of the counter. Tonight we are behind it. There is a boy of 15 in this shop, and he has been bound to it for 7 years, and at this moment he is sweeping a cold floor in the dark, an hour before anyone else in the lane has stirred. The shutters are still up. The fire is out. The whole long room smells of aniseed and beeswax and something faintly bitter that he has not yet learned the name of. He is the apothecary's apprentice, and tonight we are going to follow him. We will follow him first through one ordinary working day, from that dark hour before dawn to the moment the shutters go up again at night, and then, more slowly, through the 7 years of his indenture, from the first morning when he was allowed to hold nothing but a broom to the day, 7 winters later, when he stood in a panelled hall by the river and was examined in Latin on the contents of the drawers behind him. That is the whole of our evening. 1 boy, 1 counter, 7 years told slowly, in the order he lived them. Settle in properly now. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. There is no need to remember any of this, not a single name, not a single remedy, not one of the strange old weights he will learn to reckon by. If you drift off somewhere in the 2nd hour and wake in the morning, having missed the rest entirely, then the evening will have done exactly what it was meant to do. The city outside his shutters is London, and the century is the 17th. Take that as loosely as you like. There is a river somewhere off to the south, and a great deal of timber and plaster leaning over narrow lanes, and a trade in this particular street that has been quietly practiced here for longer than anyone can properly say. Inside, there are perhaps 200 small drawers, each with a Latin word painted on its front. There is a mortar on the counter so heavy that 2 grown men would struggle to lift it. There is a jar of leeches on the shelf by the window, which he must remember to look at before the morning is out. And there is a broom in his hands, and a floor to sweep, and an hour of quiet before the day begins. Let us begin there, in the dark, with the sweeping. He wakes without being woken. That is the first thing worth saying about him. After the first month or 2 of an apprenticeship, no one had to come and shake a boy out of sleep, because the shape of the day had settled into him below the level of thought, and his eyes opened in the dark at the same hour, whether he wished them to or not. Where he had been sleeping depended entirely on the house. In a prosperous shop with a deep building behind it, he might have a garret room under the tiles, shared with 1 or 2 other apprentices, with a straw mattress and a chest for his few possessions, and a window the size of a dinner plate. In a smaller establishment, he slept much closer to the trade, sometimes in the shop itself, on a truckle bed that was pushed under the counter by day and pulled out at night. This was not thought a hardship so much as an arrangement of convenience, because it meant that when someone knocked at the door in the small hours, and people did knock at the door in the small hours, there was already a body in the room to answer it. The cold is the thing the old accounts return to most often. A shop full of jars and glass and stone floors holds cold the way a cellar does. In winter the water in the pail by the back door carried a skin of ice on it, and the first task of the morning was frequently to break that skin with the heel of his hand before he could wash. His fingers, in those first weeks, were rarely entirely warm between November and March, and the chilblains that came with the season were regarded by everyone, including him, as simply part of being young and new and low in the household. He dressed in the dark because a candle was a small expense, but a real one, and a boy who burned tallow to find his own stockings would hear about it. There is something in this that is easy to miss from a distance of centuries. Almost every rule he lived under was, at bottom, about thrift, not cruelty, not discipline for its own sake, but the plain arithmetic of a household in which every article of stock had been bought with money and every hour of light had been paid for. Down the stairs, then, in the dark, one hand on the wall, counting the treads because he had learned them in the first week and no longer needed to see them. The shop at that hour was a different room entirely from the shop at noon. In daylight it was a place of color and business, glazed jars catching the light, the counter busy, people coming and going. Before dawn it was a low cave of shapes. He knew where everything was by memory and by shin. The corner of the counter that caught his hip if he turned too quickly, the stool that lived in the same spot every night. The 2 steps down into the back room, which more than one apprentice discovered the hard way in his first fortnight. The sweeping came first. This sounds like the smallest of tasks, and in a sense it was, but the floor of an apothecary's shop was not an ordinary floor. Over the course of a working day it accumulated a very particular kind of debris. Spilled powders, fragments of dried root that had snapped off while being weighed, seeds, chips of wax from ceiling, straw carried in from the street on 20 pairs of shoes, broken glass, more often than anyone would have liked. All of this had to be gathered up and taken out before the day's work began, partly because a clean shop was a shop that looked well ordered to a customer, and partly for a reason that would have been explained to him early and firmly. A powder trodden into a floor is a powder that has been paid for and will never be sold. He swept toward the door, always, and the sweepings went out into the lane or into the yard, depending on the household and the season and the temper of the neighbors. Then the fire. In most shops there was more than one to think about, and they were not the same kind of fire at all. There was the household fire in the kitchen, which was somebody else's business, usually the maid's. There was the fire in the shop itself, small, for warmth and for the comfort of customers on a raw morning. And there was the furnace or the stove in the back room, which was the serious one, the one that heated the still and the pans and the water bath, and which had its own long temperament and its own rules. Laying a fire in a house without matches was a craft in itself, and it was one of the first crafts he learned properly. If the household kept a fire banked overnight, and most did, it was a matter of raking back the ash, finding the small red heart of it that had survived until morning, and coaxing it upward with kindling until it took. If the fire had died altogether, which happened, the whole business became a great deal longer and involved either a tinderbox and a good deal of patience or a humiliating walk to a neighbor's door with a covered pan to beg a live coal. Every apprentice in the street knew the shame of that walk, and every apprentice in the street had made it at least once. By the time the fire had caught and steadied, there was usually a faint greyness at the edges of the shutters. He would notice it without stopping. There was still water to fetch. Water came from a conduit, or a public pipe, or a well, or in a good year from a private cistern in the yard, and it came in buckets carried by hand. A shop that distilled, and every apothecary's shop distilled, went through an astonishing quantity of it, not only for the stills themselves, but for the cooling water in the worm tub, for the water bath, and for washing. Washing, in this trade, was constant. Every vessel that had held one preparation had to be scarred before it held another, and the scarring fell to the youngest hands in the house. So his morning, before the shop had even opened, ran something like this: sweep, lay and light the fires, fetch water, wash and dry the vessels left dirty from the day before, which the older apprentice had left for him with perfect confidence that they would be done. Set out the things his master would want to find ready. Check that the sand in the sand bath had not been let go cold. Look in on the still, if anything had been left running slowly overnight, and rouse someone older if it looked wrong. And through all of it, listening. That is a detail worth pausing on. An apprentice in his first year was expected to be silent, but he was not expected to be inattentive. The house woke around him in a sequence he came to know as well as his own breathing. A door on the floor above, the master's cough, the maid on the stairs, the journeyman, if the shop kept one, coming down last and least willingly of anybody. There is a particular quality to that hour that the surviving accounts, sparse as they are, keep circling back to. It was the only part of the day that belonged to him. From the moment the shutters came down, he was at the disposal of every voice in the building and every stranger who walked through the door. But in that first grey hour, with a broom in his hand and a fire beginning to take, and nobody yet awake to want anything of him, his time was, in a small and unofficial way, his own. Boys being boys, a certain amount of that hour was spent in ways that would not have appeared on any list of duties. Looking into drawers he had not yet been shown. Lifting the lid of a jar to smell what was inside. Reading very slowly the Latin painted on the front of the shop rounds, and trying to work out which word went with which smell. More than one apothecary's memoir mentions learning half the shop this way, in stolen minutes before dawn, long before anyone thought to teach it formally. There was one further duty of that hour in the houses that kept it, and it belonged to the master rather than to the trade. In many households the whole family gathered briefly before the day began, for a reading and a prayer, and the apprentices were expected to be there, washed and standing at the back. It took a quarter of an hour. It was, for a good many boys, the only quarter of an hour in the day in which nobody wanted anything of them at all. And then the household was down, and the hour was over, and the day proper began. Let us turn now to the question of how he came to be standing in that shop at all. No boy of 15 arrived behind an apothecary's counter by accident. He arrived there by a legal instrument, written on parchment or on a printed form filled in by hand, and signed and sealed in the presence of witnesses, and the name of that instrument was an indenture. The word itself comes from the way the document was made. 2 copies were written on a single sheet, one for the master and one for the apprentice or his family. and the sheet was then cut apart along a wavy or toothed line, an indented line, so that the two halves could later be fitted back together to prove that both were genuine. It is a small thing, but it tells you something about the world he was entering. This was a society that took the binding of a boy to a trade seriously enough to build a forgery test into the paper it was written on. The terms were remarkably consistent across the trades and across the century. 7 years was the standard, not 5, not 10, but 7. A number so fixed in custom that it had long since stopped needing a justification. In practice it meant that a boy bound at 14 or 15 came out at 20, 1 or 22. Which is to say that the apprenticeship covered exactly the span between childhood and legal adulthood, and delivered him into the world at the moment he was old enough to hold property, take a wife, and open a shop of his own. The apothecaries, it should be said, often preferred their apprentices a little older than the general run, and often demanded that they arrive already able to read Latin, or at least able to be taught it quickly. This was not snobbery. It was simply that a boy who could not read the word on a drawer was a boy who could not safely be sent to that drawer. Money changed hands. The family of the apprentice paid a premium to the master, and the size of that premium said a great deal about where a trade sat in the world. A boy bound to a country weaver might come with a few pounds, or with nothing at all if the parish was placing an orphan. A boy bound to a London apothecary came with a good deal more, sometimes £50, sometimes considerably above that in a fashionable shop with a wealthy clientele. It was, in the plainest terms, the purchase of a future. What the family was buying was 7 years of instruction, 7 years of board and lodging, and, at the end of it, the right to practice a trade that could keep a man comfortably for the rest of his life. The document itself made obligations run in both directions, and it is worth going slowly over what each side promised, because the wording had a wonderful old formality to it that survived almost unchanged for centuries. The master undertook to teach. That was the whole substance of his side of the bargain, and it was expressed with a simplicity that has not been improved upon. He would instruct the apprentice in his art, or cause him to be instructed. He would provide him with meat, drink, lodging and, depending on the agreement, clothing, and he would do so for the full term. In some indentures the master also promised a suit of clothes at the end, so that the young man walked out into his freedom, looking like someone who might be trusted with a shop. The apprentice, for his part, undertook a great deal more, and the list of what he promised not to do is one of the more revealing documents of the age. He would serve his master faithfully, keep his secrets, and obey his lawful commands. He would do no damage to his master's goods, nor allow it to be done by others without warning him. He would not waste his master's goods, nor lend them unlawfully. He would not commit fornication, nor contract matrimony within the term. He would not play at cards, dice, tables, or any unlawful games. He would not haunt taverns or alehouses. He would not absent himself by day or by night without leave. Read that list slowly, and a picture assembles itself of exactly what young men in cities were understood to get up to, and had been getting up to for a very long time, and were expected to go on getting up to unless somebody wrote it down and made them sign it. The marriage clause deserves a moment of its own. It seems severe to modern ears, and in individual cases it certainly was, but its logic was economic rather than moral. A married apprentice would need a household of his own, and a household of his own meant wages, and the whole structure of apprenticeship rested on the arrangement that the boy was not paid in money, but in instruction, food, and a bed. A wife broke the arithmetic, so the trades forbade her, and a young man who fell in love in his 5th year had a very long and careful wait ahead of him. Where he lived was not negotiable either. He lived in his master's house, at his master's table, under his master's authority, and in the eyes of the law he stood roughly where a son stood. The master could correct him, which in the language of the time included a degree of physical correction that most households considered ordinary, and some individual masters took a great deal further than the custom allowed. If he ran away, he could be pursued, advertised for, and brought back. Notices for absconded apprentices appear regularly in the newspapers of the later part of the century, describing a young man's height and hair, and the coat he was wearing when last seen, in the same practical tone used for a lost horse. Against all that, it is easy to picture the whole arrangement as a kind of servitude, and for some boys in some houses that is very nearly what it was. But the accounts that survive from the inside are more complicated. A great many apprentices ate better in their master's house than they had at home. A great many were taught to read and write and reckon at a level their fathers never reached. And at the end of it, if they served the term and satisfied the company, they stepped into a livelihood that their families could not have bought them any other way. For the apothecaries in particular, there was an additional layer to all this, and it was quite new in the 17th century. In 1617, the apothecaries of London separated from the Grocers' Company and were incorporated as a society of their own, the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. Before that, the men who sold drugs had sat inside a company that also dealt in pepper, sugar, dried fruit, and every other imported commodity, and the apothecaries had argued for years, with some heat, that a trade in medicines had no business being lumped in with a trade in currants. The consequence for our boy was concrete. His indenture was not merely a private agreement between his father and a shopkeeper. It was registered, or was supposed to be, with the society. His term was recorded. At its end he would be examined, and not by his master, whose judgment in the matter of his own apprentice was understood to be less than perfectly disinterested, but by a committee of other apothecaries at the society's hall. The trade, in other words, had taken responsibility for the standard of its own new members, and it did so through a boy's indenture. There was also, from the beginning, a limit on numbers. A master could not simply take on apprentices by the dozen and run a shop on unpaid hands. The society, like the other companies, restricted how many apprentices a single master might hold at one time, precisely so that instruction remained instruction and did not quietly turn into cheap labor. The rule was broken here and there, as rules are, but its existence tells you what the anxiety was. The day the indenture was signed would have been remembered for a lifetime. It usually happened in the master's parlor or at the company hall, with the boy's father or guardian present, and it involved a certain amount of ceremony, some of it warm and some of it merely legal. The document was read aloud, or at least its substance was. The premium was handed over. The seals were fixed. And then, in the ordinary way of these things, the father went home, and the boy did not. That is perhaps the moment to hold on to as we go forward tonight. Whatever else the 7 years were, they began with a door closing behind a father, and a boy of 15 left standing in a room full of jars whose names he could not yet read, being told, in all likelihood, to take that broom over there and start at the far wall. There is no need to feel any particular way about it. It was, by the standards of its own century, an ordinary and rather fortunate beginning, and the boy himself would probably have said so. Let us go back to him now, and to the shop where the household is awake at last and the shutters are about to come down. The shutters came down at a fixed hour, and the hour depended on the season, and in a well-run street the neighbors did it more or less together. There is something almost musical in the descriptions of it. The rattle of the bars being drawn, the flat wooden clap of a shutter folding back against the front of a building, repeated down the length of a lane as one shop after another opened its face to the day. They were heavy, those shutters, solid boards, often hinged, sometimes lifted out entirely and stacked inside, and in many shops the lower one dropped forward on hinges to become a shelf or a small display board projecting into the street. This was one of the earliest tasks entrusted to a new apprentice that involved anything resembling risk, since a dropped shutter could take a shin off a passer-by or break a pane, and it was one of the first things he was quietly proud of doing well. With the shutters down, light came in, and with the light the shop became itself. Above the door, or hanging out over the lane on an iron bracket, was the sign. This mattered more than it might seem. Numbered street addresses did not properly arrive until much later, and so a London shop was identified by its picture. A customer was not directed to a number but to a sign, and the whole city navigated by them. For apothecaries, the commonest by far was the mortar and pestle, sometimes gilded, sometimes painted, occasionally carved in wood, and large enough to be seen from the end of the street. Others took a unicorn, which had a long association with the trade through the supposed medicinal virtue of its horn. Some took a serpent, or a phoenix, or the golden head, or simply the arms of the society, which showed Apollo with a bow standing over a defeated dragon, an image the society itself explained as the healing art overcoming disease. The signs creaked. Every account of an old city street mentions this. On a windy night, an entire lane of iron brackets groaned and knocked, and after a certain number of accidents involving falling signboards, the practice was eventually curtailed. But for our boy's lifetime, the street above his head was a slow-moving gallery of painted objects. Now, the interior. This is the room we have come for, and it is worth taking slowly, because it is one of the great sensory spaces of the early modern city. The first thing anyone noticed was the smell, and no two shops smelled the same. There was a common base to it, warm and dry and vegetal, the accumulated breath of hundreds of dried herbs and roots and bark stored in one room over many years. Over that came the sweeter notes, aniseed and licorice and rose and orange flower water, and the resins, frankincense and benzoin and storax, which are heavy and balsamic and cling to the wood of a room for decades. And under and through it all ran the sharper things, the bitterness of aloes and wormwood, the medicinal tar of pitch and turpentine, the ammoniacal sting of spirit of hartshorn. If a bottle had been opened, a visitor stepping in off the street would take a moment to adjust. Regular customers stopped noticing at all. The apprentice, after his first fortnight, could no longer smell the shop as a whole, but had begun instead to smell its parts, which is exactly what his training required of him. Then the eye travelled up. The back and side walls of a proper apothecary's shop were fitted floor to ceiling with shelving, and on those shelves stood the vessels, arranged with a care that was partly practical and partly, frankly, theatrical. On the upper shelves stood the shop rounds, the tall lidded jars that carried the painted or gilded Latin names of their contents on a decorative label, often a scroll or a car touch with a little painted ribbon above it. In the finer shops these were Delftware, tin glazed and brilliant white, painted in cobalt blue with birds and angels and baskets of fruit around the label. They were expensive, and they were meant to be seen. A young apothecary setting up on his own borrowed money for them, because a shop lined with fine jars announced, without a word being spoken, that this was a serious house. Below and among them stood the smaller vessels, squat gallipots of tin-glazed earthenware for ointments and conserves and electuaries, wide-mouthed so a spatula could reach the bottom. Syrup jars with a spout and a handle, shaped rather like a jug, for the thick, sweet preparations that would not pour from a narrow neck. Pill tiles of glazed earthenware or marble, flat and smooth, for rolling. Glass carboys and bottles for the waters and spirits, sometimes colored, sometimes filled with tinted liquid purely for display in the window. And beneath all of that, at working height, ran the drawers. The drawers were where the real trade lived. A serious shop had a great many of them, sometimes 100, sometimes 200 or 300, in banks that filled an entire wall from counter height to shoulder height. Each was faced with its Latin name, often in gold on a dark ground, and each held one dried simple, which is the old word for a single unmixed medicinal substance: root, bark, leaf, seed, flower, gum, mineral. The drawers were shallow, so that a hand could sweep the whole of the contents forward, and they were made to run smoothly, because a drawer that stuck was a drawer that would eventually be wrenched and spill. The counter itself was long, heavy and worked. On it stood the Great Mortar, which we will come to shortly, and which deserves its own hour. Beside it the balances, hanging from a stand, with their little brass pans and their box of weights. A pill tile, spatulas of horn and of bone and of steel, a knife, sheets of paper for wrapping powders, sealing wax, twine on a spindle, string boxes, and somewhere at one end the day book, in which everything sold on credit was written down in an ordinary and unglamorous hand. Under the counter were the things not on show: the spare gallipots, the rags, the sweepings pan, the truckle bed. In the smaller shops, and in almost every shop, some corner sacred to the master, which the apprentice learned early not to open. There was, in most shops, a chair or a bench for customers, set a little to one side of the counter, because a great deal of this trade involved a person describing a private trouble at some length. And a shop with nowhere to sit was a shop in which those conversations were short. And in the window, where there was one worth the name, stood the large coloured carboys filled with liquid, tinted green or amber or deep red, which were not medicines at all, but an advertisement, understood by everyone in the street to mean that the trade of this house was pharmacy. Beyond the shop, through a doorway or down a step at the back, lay the parts of the building the customer never saw. The back room with its furnace and its stills. A yard, if the house was fortunate, where things could be dried in the sun and where the water butt stood. A drying loft under the roof, hung with bunches of herbs in season and smelling, in August like a warm meadow. A cellar, cold and dark, where the things that spoiled in heat were kept, and where the barrels stood. The shop was the face of the business. Everything behind it was the body. Hanging from the ceiling there might be, in some shops, the curiosities. This is the detail that has come down to us most vividly in paintings and in later reconstructions, and it has been exaggerated, but it was not invented. A stuffed crocodile or a dried lizard slung from the beams. A tortoise shell, a narwhal tusk, if the household could possibly stretch to it, sold and understood by many as the horn of the unicorn. Bizarre stones in a small box, which were the concretions found in the stomachs of certain animals and were believed to draw poison. Dried starfish, a snakeskin. It is easy to laugh at all this, and easier still to assume the apothecary was simply a showman. He was, in part. But the objects were also, in the medicine of the age, genuinely part of the materia medica, and a customer asking for powdered pearl or for the horn of a unicorn was asking for something that the standard books of the day told him to ask for. The apprentice, on his first morning, saw all of this at once and understood almost none of it. By the end of 7 years, he would be able to stand in the middle of that room with his eyes closed and tell you what was in the third drawer from the left on the second bank, and roughly how much of it remained, and whether it had come in from a good parcel or a poor one. That transformation is the whole story of his indenture, and it happened one small object at a time. Let us turn now to the mortar, because a great deal of his first 2 years was spent looking into it. If you were to walk down a street of apothecaries and grocers in an old European city with your eyes shut, you would know exactly where you were by the sound. It was a slow, dull, ringing knock, repeated over and over in no great hurry, coming from open doorways all along the lane. That was the mortar, and behind every mortar was a boy. The great mortars of the trade were made of bell metal, which is a bronze of copper and tin mixed in roughly the proportion used for casting church bells, and they were cast by the same founders who cast the bells. They rang faintly when struck. Some carried decoration around the outside, ribs and figures and occasionally a date and the founder's name, and some carried nothing at all. What they all had in common was weight. A shop mortar might weigh 100 weight or more, and it was not moved once it had been set in its place on the counter or on its own heavy block. It simply lived there for generations, growing a little smoother inside every year. The pestle matched it, a heavy bar of the same metal with a swelling at each end, one for pounding and one for grinding, and a waist in the middle for the hands. There were smaller mortars too, and each material had its proper one. Marble for things that must not be tainted with metal, and for gums and resins that would stick. Glass for anything acid, or for substances that would react with a metal surface. Wedge wood, later in the story, when a hard fine ceramic became available. Wood for a few soft things, iron for the coarsest and toughest work. Choosing the right one was an early lesson, and a lesson that was easy to fail. And the boy who ground something oily in a porous marble mortar and left a ghost of it there, for the next preparation learned about it in short order. The work itself was simple to describe and difficult to do well for 4 hours at a stretch. Some things were pounded: hard dry roots, barks, seeds, gums, resins, and the tough woody stems went into the great mortar to be broken down by main force, with the pestle lifted and let fall in a steady rhythm. Rhythm was everything. A boy who hammered as fast as he could was a boy who was exhausted in 20 minutes and who scattered half the drawer over the counter. A boy who had learned the trade let the weight of the pestle do the work and simply guided it, and could keep going at that unhurried knocking pace for as long as it took. Some things were ground, which is a different motion entirely. The pestle turned in circles against the wall of the mortar, with steady downward pressure, reducing what the pounding had already broken into a fine and even powder. Some things were bruised only. A fresh leaf or a soft aromatic seed was not meant to be reduced to dust. It was meant to be broken just enough to open it, so that the water or the spirit that would be poured over it could reach inside. And some things were never put in a mortar at all. Anything that could be reduced by rubbing on a grater, anything that would simply smear, anything so precious that the loss clinging to the sides of the vessel mattered more than the labor saved. After the mortar came the sieve. Powders were graded by being passed through sieves of different fineness, made of hair or of woven wire or of leather pierced with holes, and there were formal names in the books for the different degrees of fineness. What did not pass went back into the mortar and was worked again. A very fine powder, of the kind wanted for a preparation that would be swallowed dry or dusted onto a wound, might go through this cycle a great many times, and the boy doing the cycling was rarely told how many times in advance. Certain jobs were dreaded, and they turn up in the reminiscences with a consistency that suggests every apprentice in Europe hated the same things. Grinding hard resins on a warm day, when the friction softened them and turned the powder to a sticky mass that clung to the pestle and had to be scraped and started again, working with anything that stung the eyes, and there were several, reducing dried cantharides, the blistering beetles, which was genuinely unpleasant work and could raise blisters on the hands of a careless boy. Powdering ipecacuanha, which throws a dust that provokes fierce sneezing and streaming eyes in almost anyone who breathes it. Working with anything that smelled strongly of decay, of which the animal materia medica offered several examples. Set against that, some jobs were quietly pleasant, and those are remembered too. Bruising fresh mint or balm, or rosemary in the early morning, which filled the whole shop with a scent that hung about for hours. Grinding cinnamon or cloves or nutmeg for a spiced preparation. Pounding rose petals for a conserve, which stained the pestle a deep pink that took days to wear away. There was one more thing the mortar did, and it was not medicinal at all. It was a place to hide. A boy at the mortar was visibly and audibly working. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody sent him out into the rain. As long as the knocking continued, he was accounted for, and a certain amount of daydreaming, of memorizing, of listening to the conversation at the counter, and quietly learning the trade by ear, went on behind that steady, ringing, unhurried sound. His arms and shoulders changed in the first year. That is mentioned too, and it is easy to believe. A boy who arrived thin left the mortar after 18 months with the forearms of a man who worked. And it was one of the few marks of the trade that showed on the outside. The mortar also taught him something less obvious, and it is worth pausing on, because it belongs to the whole shape of his training. Grinding is one of the very few operations in the shop where the material tells you, continuously and honestly, how the work is going. A powder announces itself. It changes color as it becomes finer. It changes the sound it makes against the metal. It changes the resistance felt through the pestle. A boy standing at a mortar for 2 years without being taught a single word of theory would nonetheless come away with his hands educated, able to tell by feel alone when a root had given up everything it was going to give. That is very close to how the entire trade was passed on, not by lecture, and only rarely by book, but by putting a substance into a boy's hands over and over until his hands knew it. When he came at last to be examined in a panelled room by men he had never met, a great deal of what he answered from would not have felt to him like knowledge at all. It would have felt like something closer to memory of the body. There was a small etiquette attached to the Great Mortar that outsiders never noticed and everyone in the trade understood. It was not shared. One person worked it at a time, and a second person did not reach in to hurry things along, because 2 hands in 1 mortar is how a pestle meets a knuckle. A boy waiting for his turn stood back and did something else, and it was not used for anything outside the trade. The kitchen had its own mortar for spices and for sugar, and the shop mortar stayed in the shop, and a maid who came in to borrow, it would be sent back out again. This was not possessiveness. It was the same rule that governed everything else on that counter, which was that a vessel used for medicine was used for nothing but medicine for the whole of its life. Cleaning the mortar was the last act of every operation, and it was as much a part of the discipline as the grinding. Every trace of one substance had to be out of it before the next went in, because a residue of something bitter in a preparation meant for a child, or worse, a residue of something active in a preparation meant to be mild, was the beginning of a disaster. In a careful house the mortar was scoured with sand or with bran, wiped, dried, and left clean. And the last thing a conscientious apprentice did before he went up to bed was to run a hand around the inside of it, in the dark to be sure. Let us turn now to the wall of drawers behind him, and to the long, slow business of learning what was in them. He was not taught the drawers in any order that a modern instructor would recognize. There was no first lesson, no list handed to him, no sequence from the simple to the difficult. He was taught them in the order the day happened to require, which meant that the first dozen substances he learned properly were whichever dozen the customers of that particular week happened to ask for. The learning began with errands. His master or the journeyman would call out a name, and he would be expected to go to the wall and come back with the drawer, or with a measure of what was in it. In the first weeks he was told exactly which drawer. Then he was told the name and left to find it. Then, in time, he was told nothing at all beyond the name of the preparation being made, and was expected to know that it needed 4 things, and to have all 4 on the counter before he was asked. The names on the drawers were Latin, and that Latin was neither classical nor especially elegant. It was a working shorthand, abbreviated wherever it could be, and full of forms that would have puzzled Cicero considerably. Radix for a root, folium for a leaf, phlos for a flower, semen for a seed, cortex for a bark, herba for the whole plant, lignum for a wood, gummy for a gum, sal for a salt, oleum for an oil, spiritus for a distilled spirit, aqua for a water. The plant name followed in the genitive, and the whole thing was frequently squeezed down to a handful of letters and a flourish, because the label was only so wide. So a drawer might carry the equivalent of root of gentian, or seed of the holy thistle, and a boy who could read the 6 or 7 leading words could work out a great deal of the wall without knowing much Latin at all. This is why the apothecaries wanted a lad with some grammar school behind him. The Latin was not there to make the trade seem learned, although it did that too. It was there because it was the one language that meant the same thing in London, in Paris, in Leiden, and in Venice. There were, by convention, 3 great kingdoms of the materia medica, and the boy learned to think in them because the books he would eventually be examined on were arranged that way. The vegetable kingdom was much the largest, and it was the heart of the shop. Here were the roots that came in dried and hard as wood, gentian and licorice and elecampane and rhubarb and marshmallow. The barks, cinnamon and cassia, oak and willow, and, from the middle of the century onward, the one that changed everything, the Peruvian bark, brought back from South America and found to break the agues and fevers that no European remedy had ever reliably touched. It came in curled quills, bitter beyond description, and it was expensive, and it worked, and a shop that had it said so. Then the leaves and the herbs, senna and wormwood and rue and sage and balm and mint and betony, which lost their virtue steadily with time. So that last year's stock was quietly moved down the wall, and this year's took its place. Then the seeds, aniseed, and fennel and coriander and caraway, the warm ones, the things given for a colicky child or a windy stomach, and among the most frequently asked for items in any shop. Then the flowers, rose and violet and chamomile and elder and lavender, gathered in their season and dried in the loft. Then the gums and resins, which arrived from a very long way off, and which had their own mystique. Frankincense and myrrh out of Arabia, gum or Arabic, benzoin from the East Indies, storax, aloes, in dark brittle lumps, unbelievably bitter, scammony and colocynth and jalap, the fierce purges kept where a careless hand would not reach them. Camphor, volatile, kept tightly closed because it simply left if you did not. Opium, in cakes, kept closer still. The animal kingdom was smaller, stranger to modern ears, and entirely respectable at the time. Hartshorn, the shaving of deer antler, from which a pungent spirit was drawn. Spermaceti, from the head of the sperm whale, prized for salves. Musk and civet, kept in tiny quantities and worth many times their weight in silver. Powdered pearl, powdered coral, and crab's eyes, which were not eyes at all, but small stony concretions from the crayfish, used as a mild antacid. Honey and beeswax in quantity, cantharides, the blistering beetles, and in some shops and some periods mumia, which was exactly what the name suggests, and which the pharmacopoeias of the day listed without a blush. The mineral kingdom was smaller still, but growing fast, and it was the part of the trade that would eventually swallow the rest. sulfur, alum, niter, vitriol, both the blue and the green, sal ammoniac, antimony in various preparations, and a great deal of controversy attached to it. Mercury in several forms, some of them extremely active, all of them handled with a caution that the boy was taught early and loudly. Lead, chiefly in plasters, iron filings, chalk, bowl of fine clay, gold and silver in leaf. More for the appearance of a preparation than for anything else. Learning what these were was only the first half of it. The second half, and the harder one, was learning what good ones looked like. This is the part of the training that no book could give him, and the part the old apothecaries spoke of with the most pride. Every substance in the shop had a set of signs by which quality was judged, and those signs were taught hand to hand. Good senna should be a particular fresh green, not brown, and should smell faintly sweet. Good rhubarb, snapped across, should show a marbled pattern in the broken face, and should feel gritty between the teeth. Good saffron should be a deep orange-red throughout, not pale at the ends where it had been stretched with something cheaper. Good camphor should be translucent, not chalky. He was taught to break things, chew things, smell things, hold things up to the window, rub them between his palms and warm them to release the scent. Within 2 years he could reject a parcel of dried herb by smell alone from across the room, and he could tell you why. And this mattered enormously, because the trade in drugs was, and had always been, riddled with adulteration, saffron stretched with safflower or with dyed fiber, ground pepper let down with anything of the same color, expensive gums bulked out with cheap ones, rhubarb of the finest sort replaced by a common garden species of no great virtue. The whole apparatus of inspection that the Society of Apothecaries built up around itself existed because of this, and the eye that could spot it was the single most valuable thing a young man carried out of his apprenticeship. It is worth pausing, before we leave the wall, on how far most of it had travelled to get there, because the drawers of a London shop were a map of the world's trade, and the boy who opened them was handling the far ends of the earth without ever leaving his street. Almost nothing in the resin drawers had grown within 2,000 miles of him. The frankincense and the myrrh came out of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, gathered as tiers of gum from trees by people whose names never travelled with the goods. Benzoin and camphor came from the East Indies. Cinnamon came from Ceylon, cloves and nutmeg from a very small number of islands that European powers were at that moment fighting over with real ferocity. Pepper, ginger, cardamom and turmeric came from the Malabar coast. Senna came out of Egypt and Arabia, and rhubarb, the good sort, came overland out of Central Asia through Turkey and Russia by routes so long and so tangled that the merchants of Europe argued for centuries about where it actually grew. Then there were the newer arrivals, and this is the exciting part, because our apprentice was alive for some of them. The Americas were sending back things Europe had never had. Guaiacum wood, sarsaparilla, tobacco, which was taken as seriously as a medicine as it was as a pleasure, jalap out of Mexico, ipecacuanha out of Brazil, and above all the bark from Peru, which arrived in Europe in the middle of the century, was fought over and doubted and championed, and which turned out to be the first European medicine that reliably stopped a specific disease. To a boy standing at a drawer, This meant something quite concrete. The materia medica was not fixed. Things came into it during his own working life, and things went quietly out of it, and a shop that was still selling what its grandfather's shop had sold, and nothing more, was a shop falling behind. By the middle of his term, he no longer had to read the labels. He knew the wall the way you know the layout of the house you grew up in, and he reached for the third drawer of the fourth bank without looking. And his hand arrived there before his mind had finished forming the name. Let us turn now to everything in that shop that would not keep. There was a ritual of the drawers that many shops observed, and it comes down to us in enough separate accounts to sound like common practice. Every so often, perhaps quarterly, perhaps at the turn of the year, the whole wall was gone through, drawer by drawer. The contents were turned out, looked at, smelled, sifted for insects, and either returned or condemned. The dried herbs of the previous season that had faded to a hay color and lost their scent went on the fire, because a herb without its virtue was worse than no herb at all, and a shop that sold it was selling a lie. The boy's job in this was to carry, to hold, to sweep, and to watch, and it was, quietly, one of the best weeks of teaching he ever got. In 3 or 4 days he handled every substance in the shop in sequence, with an older man beside him saying what each was, and what was wrong with it. And then there were the things that did not merely fade but died, and minding those fell, without exception, to the youngest hands in the house. The leeches came first, and they were the most demanding. A shop that supplied leeches kept them in a wide-mouthed jar, usually of glass so they could be seen, sometimes of glazed earthenware, with water in the bottom and a covering of linen or of perforated metal tied over the top. That covering was not decoration. A leech is an extraordinary escape artist, capable of climbing a wet glass wall and squeezing through a gap that looks impossible. And an apprentice who tied the cloth carelessly came down in the morning to find a dozen of them making their slow way across the shop floor. The water had to be changed regularly, and it had to be the right water, soft water. River water or rainwater, never water heavy with lime, and never water that had stood in a metal vessel. It was poured off gently and replaced, and the boy learned to do this without bruising them, because a bruised leech would not feed, and a leech that would not feed was worthless. They were kept cool and out of direct sun. They were kept quiet. They were counted because they were stock and because they were regularly asked for. And they were watched for signs of sickness, since a jar could turn overnight, and one dead leech left among the living would foul the water and take the rest with it. Fishing out the dead ones was the least popular standing duty in the entire shop. The leech itself was, at that date, an entirely mainstream instrument of medicine, not a curiosity. Bloodletting was central to the whole humoral system, and where a lancet was too crude for the place, behind an ear at the temple, around a swollen joint on a child, the leech did the work more gently. An apprentice was expected in time not only to keep them but to apply them, and applying them was a skill of its own. A leech that did not wish to bite could be encouraged by wetting the skin, or by a drop of something sweet, or by a slight warming. One that had fed to satisfaction let go by itself, which was the polite outcome, and one that had not could not be pulled, because pulling tore the mouth parts and left them in the wound, They were not the only living stock. Some shops kept vipers, and the reason was theriac. Theriac, or Venice treacle, was the great compound medicine of the age, an inheritance from antiquity, a preparation of dozens of ingredients pounded together with honey and left to mature for years. And one of its traditional constituents was the flesh of the viper. Where a shop made its own, it needed snakes, and where it needed snakes, it kept them in a covered box in the back room, and somebody had to feed them and clean the box. In many towns, this trade was left to specialists who supplied the shops with the flesh already prepared, which every apprentice in Europe surely regarded as an excellent arrangement. Then there were the things that were not alive, but behaved almost as though they were, in the sense that they spoiled and had to be watched. Fats and oils turned rancid, and a rancid base ruined every ointment made from it, so the fats were kept cool and were smelled before use. Syrups. If they were made too thin, fermented in the jar and pushed their covers off, and a row of syrup jars in a warm summer had to be looked at every few days. Conserves grew a bloom of mood on the surface. Dried herbs bred insects, and the small beetles and moths that lived on stored botanicals were a permanent low-grade war, fought with tight lids, with cold, with frequent turning out, and in some shops with a bunch of something strongly aromatic laid in the drawer to discourage them. Distilled waters went flat and then went off. Anything containing sugar attracted ants and wasps in season. And one common summer duty was going round the shop in the evening, making sure every sweet thing was properly covered. There was a hierarchy in all of this that the boy learned quickly. The expensive things were watched most closely. If a drawer of common chamomile spoiled, it was a nuisance. If a pot of musk or a parcel of saffron or a jar of the Peruvian bark was ruined by damp, it was a serious loss of money, and somebody would be answering for it. There was in a good many shops a garden as well, and it was alive in the most demanding sense. It was small, usually, a strip of ground behind the house, or a walled yard, or in a fortunate case a proper plot, rented a short walk away. What grew in it was the material that had to be fresh, or that was cheaper to raise than to buy. The pot herbs, rue and rosemary and sage and hyssop, mint and balm, which spread and had to be kept back, poppies, marigolds, roses, always in quantity for the water and the conserve and the syrup. Wormwood in a corner where nothing else was wanted. Somebody had to water it, weed it, cut it in season, and keep the cat and the neighbor's chickens out of it, and that somebody was, without any discussion, the apprentice. It was one of the pleasanter duties in a hot summer, and one of the more miserable in a wet spring, and it gave a boy his first sustained experience of watching a plant go through a whole year, which is a thing no drawer of dried leaves can teach. The other living presence in the house was the cat, and the cat was not a pet but staff. A building holding several hundredweight of dried plant material was a building that mice regarded as a permanent invitation, and mice in the drawers were a disaster of a slow and unglamorous kind. So the cat had the run of the place, was fed by the maid, slept where it chose, and was tolerated in the shop itself in a way that no other animal was. Bees appeared in some households too, kept in a skep in the garden, because honey was used by the pound in this trade, and beeswax by the pound again for salves and plasters and for sealing. Where a shop kept its own. The apprentice found himself once a year involved in that too. So the last round of the day in a well-kept shop was a slow walk along the shelves with a candle, lids on, covers tied, stoppers home, leech jar secure and the cloth pulled top. The cellar door shut against the cat, or in some houses deliberately left open for exactly the same reason, since a cat in a room full of dried botanicals was worth its keep several times over. There was one more living thing in that shop, and it was the shop itself, in the sense that a building of this kind was never entirely inert. Wood moves. In a wet week the drawers swelled and stuck, and in a dry one they ran loose and rattled. Corks shrank and let air in, and the boy went along the row pressing them home. Glass stoppers seized in their necks and had to be freed with warm water and patience rather than with force. Labels lifted at the corners in damp weather and had to be pressed back with a little pace. Every one of these was a small task of no consequence whatever, and every one of them was somebody's job every week, and the somebody was him. It is a small and domestic picture, that last round, and it is one of the truest things we can say about the trade. Behind all the Latin and the gilded jars and the dragon on the society's arms, a great deal of an apothecary's life came down to keeping perishable things from perishing for one more day. Let us turn now to the door and to the people who came through it. The first customers of the morning were rarely the interesting ones, and the apprentice came to know their order almost as well as he knew the drawers. Very early came the servants. A maid sent from a household 3 streets away with a jug and a scrap of paper, wanting the same thing she had wanted last week and would want again next week. A manservant collecting something already made up and left waiting under the counter with a name on it. These transactions were brief and almost wordless. The apprentice handed the parcel over, made a mark in the day book if it went on credit, and the door closed again. Then came the working people, the ones who could not stop long. A carter with a hand crushed between a wheel and a post, wanting something put on it now, this minute, because there was a load to get to Smithfield. A woman on her way to the market with a child on her hip and an eye that had been running for a fortnight. These were the trade in its plainest form, and they wanted 3 things. Something that would work, something they could afford, and to be out of the door quickly. And then, as the morning warmed, came the people with time, and it was these who taught the apprentice most of what he learned about the trade as a human business. To understand them, it is worth being clear about what an apothecary actually was in that century, because the answer is not quite what the word suggests today. In the formal arrangement of English medicine, there were 3 ranks, and each was supposed to keep to its own ground. The physician, university trained, a member of the College of Physicians, diagnosed disease and prescribed remedies, and did not with his own hands make anything or perform surgery. The surgeon cut, set, drew teeth, dressed wounds and dealt with everything on the outside of the body. And the apothecary compounded and dispensed the medicines the physician ordered, and sold drugs, and did not prescribe. That was the theory. The practice, in every street in England, was something else entirely. The great majority of people could not afford a physician's fee, which was substantial and was paid for the visit rather than the outcome. What they could afford was to walk into a shop and described the trouble to a man who had spent 7 years learning what was in the drawers and another 20 selling from them, and who would listen, ask a few questions, and reach for something. He did not charge for the listening. He charged for what he handed over. And so, quite naturally, and without anybody ever deciding it, the apothecary became the ordinary doctor of the ordinary person, and the shop became the first place a family went when something was wrong. The College of Physicians objected to this for the better part of 2 centuries, sometimes bitterly. The apothecaries answered, reasonably enough, that the poor had to go somewhere, and that a physician who would not cross a threshold for less than a certain sum had forfeited the right to complain about who did. The matter was settled in the apothecaries' favor early in the following century, in a famous case brought against a London apothecary who had treated a patient without a physician's direction and won on appeal. The general practitioner of later ages walked out of that judgment. Our boy stood in the middle of all this without knowing any of the constitutional history, and simply watched his master do it. He watched him listen, which was the first and largest part of it. People came in and talked, and a good apothecary let them, because the description of a complaint took as long as it took, and because the useful detail rarely came first. He watched him ask, how long? Worse at night or in the morning? Better after eating or worse? Any fever? Any thirst? Has the child taken anything? Has this happened before? And what was given then? And did it answer? He watched him look at a tongue, at the whites of an eye, at the color of a hand, at a swelling, at a wound uncovered on the counter, with everyone in the shop politely pretending not to look. And he watched him decide, and this was the part that took years to understand. A great many complaints got a mild and pleasant preparation and an instruction to come back if it did not mend, because a great many complaints mend on their own, and the useful thing was to keep the patient comfortable and untroubled while they did. A few got something serious, and a certain number, and this is the part that is easily forgotten, got sent onward. A good apothecary knew the edge of his own ground. A wound that needed sewing went to the surgeon. Something that frightened him went, if the family could possibly manage it, to a physician. There is a striking amount of this in the surviving casebooks, and it is one of the quiet marks of a competent practitioner in any age. The apprentice was not part of these conversations for a long time. He stood at the mortar, or wrapped parcels, or fetched what was called for, and he listened. And by his 4th or 5th year, he had heard several thousand of them. Only then, and gradually, was he allowed to answer a simple request himself, with the master within earshot, and the first time he did it his voice almost certainly came out wrong. The complaints themselves were the ordinary human catalogue, and they have not changed as much as we might expect. Coughs and colds and sore throats in enormous number in a city of coal, smoke and damp. Preparations for these were the daily bread of the shop, syrups of horehound and of licorice and of poppy, lozenges of sugar and gum, and linctuses thick enough to coat a throat. Stomachs, sore stomachs, weak stomachs, colic, wind, the aftermath of a bad dinner. Chalk, crab's eyes, the warm seeds, mint and dill and fennel waters, and the whole family of gentle bitters given before a meal to sharpen an appetite. The other end of that business, which was If the account books are anything to go by, the largest single category of medicine sold in the 17th century by a very wide margin. The age was obsessed with purging, on a theory that held that illness came from a corruption that had to be got out, and there was an entire graded arsenal for it, from mild manna and senna up through rhubarb to the fierce resins that were used with real caution. Fevers and agues, treated with cooling juleps and with sweating draughts. And once the Peruvian bark arrived, and its worth was understood, with the bark, which really did break the marsh eggs that had killed Englishmen for centuries. Atches, rheumatic pains, backs, joints, the accumulated wear of physical work, treated with plasters and liniments and a great deal of gentle rubbing. Skin, sores, itches, scalds, burns, chapped hands in winter, the whole territory of ointments and salves, which the shop made by the pound. Eyes, sore and inflamed and running, treated with waters of rose and of eyebright. And teeth, which were a torment and for which almost nothing genuinely worked. So that the shop sold a good deal of oil of cloves and a good deal of hope. And sleep, always sleep, syrup of poppies, and the various preparations of opium that came into common use in the middle of the century, when a physician in London published a form of it dissolved in wine with spices that was pleasanter to take than anything before it. Nothing in the shop was more asked for at nightfall, and nothing was handed over with more care, because the difference between a dose that let an anxious woman sleep and a dose that did something else entirely was measured in drops. There were customers of other kinds too. There were the regulars who came for something that was not quite medicine at all. Tobacco in many shops. Confectionery, since the sugar work of the apothecary and the sugar work of the confectioner were the same craft. Perfumes and sweet waters, ink, sealing wax, soap. An apothecary's shop in a small town was, in practice, a general chandlery with a professional conscience. There were the ones who came to talk. Widows, the old, the lonely. People with no particular complaint, who bought a small thing they did not need in exchange for a quarter of an hour of conversation in a warm room. Every account of a shop of any kind, in any century, contains these people, and the good masters were kind to them, and the apprentice noticed which masters were and which were not, and there were the difficult ones. The customer certain he knew better, the one who wanted a stronger dose than was proper and would not be told, the one who could not pay and knew it and came anyway, the one who came back angry because the last thing had not worked and had to be listened to all over again, patiently, with the shop full of other people. Watching his master handle that last kind was, quite possibly, the most valuable single thing in the boy's whole education, and it was not on any curriculum anywhere. Let us turn now to the pieces of paper that came in through the same door. Not every medicine was sold across the counter on the apothecary's own judgment. A steady proportion, and in a fashionable shop a large one, came in written down. The physician's bill, as it was called, was a small sheet of paper, sometimes no larger than a hand, written in a hurried Latin abbreviated almost past recognition, and it arrived by servant or in the patient's own pocket. It was, in the most literal sense, an order to the shop, and learning to read one was a distinct skill that took the better part of a year. It opened, almost invariably, with the recipe sign, the letter R, with a stroke through its leg, standing for the imperative take, and that one small mark has outlived every other convention on the page, since it is still printed at the head of a prescription pad today. Everything that followed was a list of what was to be taken, each ingredient with its quantity, written in the old apothecary's symbols, which we will come to properly in a little while. The list ran from the principal ingredient downward, and there was a formal vocabulary for the parts. The base, the thing that did the work; the helper, which assisted it; the corrector, which softened something harsh or prevented a griping; and the vehicle, the syrup or the water, or the conserve that carried the whole and made it possible to swallow. At the foot came the directions to the apothecary in the same clipped Latin: mix, let a draught be made, let it be divided into 12 powders, let pills be made of the mass, let it be strained, let there be made a bolus, and finally the direction to be written on the label for the patient, which was frequently the only part that would be rendered in English. There was a whole small dictionary of abbreviations that had to be simply memorized, and every apprentice memorized them. The mark for as much as suffices, the mark meaning of each an equal quantity, the various forms for morning, for evening, for at bedtime, for as needed, for immediately. These persisted with astonishing tenacity, and a good many of them were still being written in the same abbreviated Latin on prescriptions 3 centuries later. There was one further thing on that small sheet, and it mattered more than any of the Latin. The physician's name, or his mark, was on it, and it made the bill an instruction from a named person who could be gone back to. A slip of paper with no name on it, handed across a counter by a servant, was not a prescription at all, and a careful shop would not act on one. This is a very small piece of procedure, and it is the ancestor of a great deal that came after it. The handwriting was the problem. It has always been the problem. The complaints of apothecaries about the hand of physicians are a continuous thread running through the entire history of the trade, and they are frequently very funny and occasionally quite anxious, because a misread word in a list of quantities was not a small matter. A shop that could not make out a bill had 2 choices, neither pleasant: send the boy back across the city to ask, which delayed the patient and irritated the physician, or guess, which no responsible master would do. So the rule in a careful house was absolute. If the bill was not clear, it was not made up. The apprentice was permitted no discretion here at all. He might be entrusted with a great deal by his 5th year, but the reading of an unclear prescription was never one of them. And any boy who decided for himself what a smudged word probably meant was in the gravest trouble of his apprenticeship. There was a further discipline attached, and it was as much social as medical. The apothecary did not comment on the physician's bill. Not to the patient, not to the servant, not out loud in the shop. Whatever he privately thought of the prescription, and apothecaries had a great deal of private opinion about prescriptions. He made it up as written, or he did not make it up at all. This was a matter of professional survival as much as manners. An apothecary, who was known to second-guess physicians, would find the physicians of that quarter sending their business elsewhere within the month. Where he did have room to act was in the quiet correspondence between the 2 trades which happened away from the patient. An apothecary who saw a real problem in a bill, an incompatibility, a quantity that looked like a slip of the pen, sent a civil private note, or went himself, or held the medicine, and said he would have it ready shortly. Handled that way, it was a courtesy between professionals. Handled loudly, it was a war. The other half of this world was the pharmacopoeia, and it deserves a proper introduction, because it is one of the genuinely important books in this story. Until the early 17th century, there was no single authoritative list of how the standard medicines of London were to be made. Every shop worked from its own receipts, from continental books, from what its master's master had done. The result was that the same named medicine could differ enormously from one shop to the next, which was tolerable for a syrup of violets, and rather less tolerable for anything containing opium or antimony. In 1618, the College of Physicians published the London Pharmacopoeia, a book that set out the official formulae, and its authority was backed by royal proclamation, meaning that the apothecaries of the city were required to make their preparations according to it. It was revised repeatedly over the following century as the materia medica changed, as new drugs arrived from the Americas and the East, and as the older and more fantastical items were quietly dropped. It was in Latin, of course, which meant it was addressed to the physicians and to the educated apothecary, and to nobody else at all. And so, in 1649, an irascible and gifted London practitioner named Nicholas Culpeper published an English translation, to the considerable fury of the college, and put the official formulae of the capital into the hands of anybody who could read English. That argument over who was entitled to know how medicines were made ran for years, and it is a very old argument that has never entirely gone away. For our apprentice, the practical consequence was a shelf. Somewhere behind the counter stood the shop's copy of the Pharmacopoeia, worn, annotated in the margins in more than one hand, and beside it the master's own book of receipts, which was where the real working knowledge of that particular house lived. That second book was the treasure. In it were the proportions the master actually used, his notes on which supplier's senna was worth having, his adjustments, his private preparations, the small refinements of 30 years. It was, in a real sense, the capital of the business. It was not shown to strangers, and one of the clauses in every indenture, the promise to keep his master's secrets, existed in large part because of books like that one. There was a third book in most shops, and it was the one the apprentice used most and valued least at the time. It was the dispensatory, which is to say the working commentary on the Pharmacopoeia, explaining each formula, giving the reasons for the proportions, noting the substitutions that were permissible when something could not be had, and warning about the combinations that spoiled. Where the Pharmacopoeia said what to make, the dispensatory said why, and a young man who read it properly understood his trade, instead of merely performing it. These books were reprinted and enlarged and argued over throughout the century, and every generation of them shed a few of the older and stranger items and took in a few of the newer ones. A shop with a 50-year-old dispensatory on the shelf, and nothing since was working from a picture of medicine that had already changed, and the more careful masters bought the new editions when they came, which was expensive and which they grumbled about and did anyway. The day came, usually somewhere in the 4th or 5th year, when the apprentice was allowed to copy from it into a book of his own. That is a moment worth pausing on, because it is as close to a graduation as the trade offered before the final examination itself. A boy who was permitted to begin his own receipt book had been judged, quietly and without ceremony, to be someone who would one day have a shop. He wrote it out in the evenings, by candle, after the shutters were up. Let us turn now to the weights, and to the arithmetic that governed every one of those receipts. Nothing in the shop was more particular than the weights, and nothing was drilled into a young apprentice with more insistence. The apothecary did not use the weights of the market. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the source of a great deal of confusion when the old books are read carelessly. A grocer weighed sugar in one system, a goldsmith weighed silver in another, and an apothecary weighed his drugs in a third, which was related to the goldsmith's, but not identical to it, and which had its own names and its own symbols, and its own peculiar arithmetic. It ran from the bottom up like this. The smallest unit was the grain, which was old beyond reckoning, and had begun life as the weight of a single grain of barley, dried and taken from the middle of the year. 20 grains made a scruple. 3 scruples made a drachm, which is the same word as dram. 8 drachms made an ounce, and 12 ounces, not 16, made a pound. That last is the detail that catches everyone. The apothecary's pound was 12 ounces, because it descended from the troy weights of the precious metal trades, and a boy who had grown up in a household where a pound of butter was 16 ounces had to unlearn the number he had known since infancy. It is a small thing, and it was the source of an enormous quantity of errors. Each unit had its own written symbol, and those symbols are the strange marks that make an old prescription look like an incantation. A little looped character for the scruple, a stroke descender for the drachm, a doubled version of the same for the ounce, and the quantities themselves were written afterward in Roman numerals, with the last one given as a J rather than an I, so that nobody could add a stroke to a finished figure and turn 2 into 3 after the fact. That single convention, the little tailed J at the end of a number, is one of the neatest pieces of fraud prevention in the history of writing, and every apprentice learned it in his first month. The balance itself was a beautiful and rather nervous instrument. In its ordinary shop form, it was a beam suspended from a stand or held in the hand by a silk cord, with a shallow pan hanging from each end. Better shops had several, graded by delicacy. A large sturdy one for ounces and pounds of common stock, a medium one for drachms, and a small, fine, jealously guarded one for grains and scruples kept in a case, taken out only for the things that mattered and never used for anything coarse. The weights lived in a fitted box in nested sizes, each in its own hollow, and the little grain weights were flat discs of thin metal, exactly as easy to lose as that description suggests. Using the balance well was a physical skill. The pans had to be clean and dry. The beam had to be allowed to come to rest by itself and not stopped with a finger. A draught from an open door could move it. And so a careful apothecary weighed his finest quantities with the shop door shut. And this is why the small balance often lived in the back room rather than on the counter. Powders were added with a horn spatula in tiny increments, and taken away again in even smaller ones, and the whole business could not be hurried. which was precisely the lesson. Liquids brought their own arithmetic. And it was worse. Volume in the shop was reckoned in minims, and fluid drachms and fluid ounces and pence. And there was the perpetual trap of the same word, meaning two different things, since an ounce by weight and a fluid ounce by measure are not the same for any liquid but water, and are wildly different for a heavy syrup. The books were usually explicit about which was meant. The busy physician's hand was not always so careful, and this was another reason a doubtful bill went back for clarification. Counting drops was worse again, and everybody knew it. A drop is not a fixed quantity. It depends on the liquid, on the lip of the vessel it falls from, on the temperature, on how steadily the hand holds. For most preparations this hardly mattered. For the tinctures of opium it mattered a great deal, and the more careful practitioners of the century were already saying so in print, recommending that anything of real activity be weighed rather than counted. Then came the reckoning itself, and here the apprentice needed arithmetic of a kind that a good many grown men of the period could not have managed. The pharmacopoeia gave a formula for a certain finished quantity, and the shop rarely wanted exactly that quantity. So everything had to be scaled. A receipt written for a pound of a compound powder had to be reduced to 2 ounces, which meant dividing every one of a dozen ingredients by 8, in a system that ran in 20s and 3s and 8s and 12s, with no decimal point anywhere in sight, and no calculating device beyond a slate, a piece of chalk and a head. He did this several times a day. He did it with his master looking over his shoulder for the first 2 years, and alone thereafter, and he was expected to be able to say aloud, without hesitation, how many grains were in 5 drachms and 2 scruples. The other arithmetic was money, and it was equally unforgiving. 12 pence to the shilling, 20 shillings to the pound, and prices reckoned in halfpence and farthings. He kept the day book and added the columns, and if his entries were poor, the household's quarterly bill was wrong, and the master heard about it in a manner that travelled downhill immediately. There was one further complication, and it caused more quiet trouble than any of the others. The weights were not the same everywhere. Within England, the apothecary's system was reasonably settled, but a receipt copied out of a book, printed in Paris or Leiden or Nuremberg, used that country's pound, and the pounds of Europe differed from one another by amounts that were small enough to be overlooked and large enough to matter. A master with a continental dispensatory on his shelf had to know which system its author had reckoned in, and had to convert and had to remember to do so every single time. For the small handful of things in which the quantity was the whole of the medicine, this was not academic at all, and it is one of the reasons the more careful writers of the period pushed so hard for a single agreed standard. The apprentice's part in it was simply to be told, firmly, that he was never to convert anything himself. Now, the fear, it is worth speaking about plainly, because it sat underneath this whole part of his training. There were substances in that shop that would kill a person, and everybody in the building knew exactly which ones they were. The strong purges in quantity, the preparations of antimony and of mercury, the opium, the cantharides, various things containing lead, a quantity of arsenic kept for particular external uses and for the killing of rats and kept in any well-ordered house, somewhere entirely separate from anything meant to be swallowed. The precautions that grew up around these were partly formal and partly the private habits of individual houses. Dangerous items kept in a separate cupboard, often locked, often high. Distinctive containers, so that no hand could mistake one for another in poor light. In many shops a rule that nothing from that cupboard was weighed by an apprentice at all, at any stage of his term. And in others a rule that it might be weighed, but only with the master or the journeyman standing beside him watching the pan. And a rule about light. Nothing of consequence was weighed by candle alone, if it could possibly wait until morning, because a boy reading a label by a guttering flame at 10 at night was a boy about to make the worst mistake of his life. Because they did happen, these mistakes, and the trade knew it. The coroner's records and the newspapers of the age carry them from time to time, and they follow a warily familiar shape, a wrong jar taken down, a quantity reader's Drams that was written as Scruples, two similar names confused, a preparation left unlabeled on a bench overnight, and used the next morning by someone who assumed. Everything the apprentice was taught about weighing was, in the end, a set of habits designed to make those particular accidents harder. Read the label. Read it again with the jar in your hand. Say the quantity aloud. Set the weights out first and look at what you have set. Never leave a compounded medicine unlabeled, not for a moment, not even to answer the door. Never fill a bottle from another bottle without reading both. It is a very old set of rules, and its descendants are still recited in every dispensary in the world. Let us turn now to the room at the back, where the fire was, and to the slow work of the still. Behind the shop, through the door the customers did not use, was the room where the medicines were actually made, and its character was entirely different. The shop was cool, orderly and public. The back room was hot, cluttered, damp with steam, and it smelled violently of whatever had been done in it that day. At its heart stood the furnace, which in a modest house was a brick-built structure with 1 or 2 fire holes, and in a grander one was a whole battery of them at different heights, each designed to hold a particular vessel at a particular distance from the flame. Fire management was the great skill of this room, because almost every operation in it depended on a temperature that had to be held steady for hours with nothing but a person's judgment and a supply of fuel. There were, in the language of the time, and degrees of fire, and they were spoken of almost as though they were substances. The first degree was gentle warmth, no more than the heat of a summer day. The second was hot enough that a hand could not be held comfortably against the vessel. The third boiled. The fourth was the fierce heat used for calcination and for the metallic work, and was not wanted often. An apprentice was taught to hold the second degree for 6 hours without letting it climb, and it is astonishing how difficult that is with a charcoal fire and a hand bellows. To make the gentler heats controllable, the trade used baths. The water bath, which the books called by its old Latin name, meaning the bath of Mary, was simply a vessel of water set over the fire, with the working vessel standing in it. Water will not exceed its boiling point, and so anything held in that bath was safe from scorching no matter how the fire behaved. It was, and remains, one of the most elegant and useful pieces of equipment ever devised, and it is still standing in laboratories today under a version of the same name. For a steadier and higher heat there was the sand bath, a pan of sand over the fire with the vessel bedded into it, which spread the heat evenly and held it long after the fire dropped. And for the very gentlest work there was the dung bath, which is exactly what it sounds like, a vessel buried in fermenting stable manure, which will hold a mild and unwavering warmth for weeks on end. It was used for long, slow digestions, and every apprentice who ever had to turn one out remembered it. The stills themselves came in several forms. The commonest was the alembic. A gourd-shaped body, called the cucurbit, sat in the bath or on the fire and held the material. Over it fitted a domed head with a channel running round the inside and a spout leading off. Vapor rose into the head, met the cooler metal or glass, condensed, ran down into the channel, and out through the spout into a receiver placed to catch it. The head was frequently kept cool by a wet cloth laid over it, replaced by an apprentice every few minutes, all afternoon. For anything that needed real cooling there was the worm tub. A long copper coil, the worm, ran down through a barrel of cold water, and the vapor traveling through it gave up its heat and emerged as liquid at the bottom. Keeping the tub cold meant carrying water, which meant, again, the youngest hands in the house. And for the most delicate work of all there was the cold still, in which the material was not boiled, but merely warmed, so that the most volatile and fragrant part came over, and nothing was scorched. The finest rose water and the best of the aromatic waters were made this way, slowly, over a very small fire, for a very long time. And the difference between one made properly and one hurried was obvious to anyone with a nose. What came out of these vessels filled a good part of the shop. The distilled waters, first, in enormous variety and in daily use. Rose water, elderflower water, fennel water, cinnamon water, peppermint water, dill water for infants, orange flower water. Some had real medicinal action. Many were essentially flavor and comfort, used as the vehicle for something else, and were none the worse for that. The spirits, which required a second and sometimes a third distillation, and which were the base for every tincture the shop made. Alcohol was the great solvent, the thing that would draw out of a plant what water would not touch, and would then keep it stable for years. And it is the reason that tincture bottles of an apothecary held their virtue, when the dried herb in the drawer beneath had long since faded. The acids and the sharp, volatile things, drawn from mineral matter at fierce heats, and among them the spirit of hartshorn, which is a solution of ammonia produced by destructive distillation of antler, and which was the smelling salt of the age, carried in the pockets of half of polite society. The essential oils, obtained by distilling aromatic plants with water and separating the fine oily layer that floated on the top of the receiver. This was slow, wasteful work, requiring great quantities of plant material for a very small yield, and it produced some of the most valuable items in the shop, and the residues, which were never thrown away. What was left in the cucurbit at the end of a distillation frequently had its own use, and a shop that discarded it was a shop wasting money, which was a thing no master permitted. There was another kind of work that happened in that room, and it sat on a border that was being redrawn during exactly the years we are describing. The back room of an apothecary was, in equipment and in method, indistinguishable from a chemical laboratory, because it was one. The same furnaces, the same vessels, the same baths, the same operations of distillation, sublimation, calcination, digestion, and crystallization. And through the 17th century, a growing number of apothecaries were using them not merely to make the preparations in the book, but to find out what things were. This was the age when the chemical medicines were pushing hard against the older herbal ones. The followers of the continental reformers argued that the virtue of a substance could be extracted, concentrated and purified by fire, and that a small quantity of a prepared mineral would do what a whole cupboard of dried herbs could not. The traditionalists answered that they were poisoning people. Both sides had a point, and the argument was conducted with a good deal of heat in print for the better part of a century. The apothecaries, standing between the physicians who prescribed and the patients who swallowed, ended up doing most of the actual work of finding out. And more than a few of the men who appear in the early history of chemistry in England learned their manipulation not in a university, but in exactly this kind of back room from a master in an apron at 15. Our apprentice would not have known he was standing in the corner of a new science. He knew he was watching a fire and wetting a cloth. The apprentice's part in all this began at the bottom, as always. He carried fuel and water. He tended the fire under instruction. He wetted the cloths on the alembic head. He watched the receiver and called out when it filled. He washed the vessels afterwards, and the washing of a still is a genuinely difficult and thankless job. But this was also the room where the long night watches happened. And the long night watches were where a certain kind of teaching took place that could not happen at the counter. A distillation that must run for 8 hours does not care what time it is. Somebody has to sit with it. And so an apprentice and a journeyman, or an apprentice and a master in a small house, sat in a warm room in the middle of the night with very little to do but watch a fire and wait for drops, and they talked. A boy sitting up with a still also learned the sound of the house at night, the settling of timbers, the watchman going by outside calling the hour, and the particular silence of a street of shops with everybody in it asleep. Almost every apothecary's memoir that mentions the training at all mentions those nights. It is where the stories were passed on, the failures and the near misses, the private opinions about physicians and about rival shops, the account of how the master had come by the shop himself. It is where a boy stopped being furniture and became, slowly, a younger colleague. Let us turn now to the bench and to the afternoon, when everything that had been ground and distilled was finally made into medicine. The afternoon belonged to the compounding bench, and the compounding bench was where the trade became a craft in the fullest sense, because almost everything made on it was made by hand, by feel, and to a standard that could be seen at a glance by anyone who knew what to look for. Start with pills, because they were the most constant work and the most revealing. A pill began as a mass. The powdered ingredients were laid on the pill tile, and to them was added just enough of something adhesive to bring the whole together into a coherent lump, a syrup, a conserve, a mucilage of gum or honey. The proportion was not written down in any useful way, because it could not be. Different powders take different quantities. The same powder takes differently in damp weather than in dry, and a mass that is too wet will not hold its shape, while a mass that is too dry will crumble at the edges. So the judgment was in the hands, and it was taught by the hands. A properly made mass, the old apothecary said, should be like a stiff dough that will take a fingerprint and hold it. That will roll without cracking and without sticking to the tile. The apprentice learned this by making it badly a great many times, and by having an older man come over, take a corner of it between finger and thumb, and say one word. The mass was then rolled into a long even cylinder called the pipe, and this was harder than it looks, because the pipe had to be the same diameter along its whole length, or every pill cut from it would be a different weight. Then the pipe was cut, which in the earlier part of our story was done with a knife and by eye, against marks scored into the tile itself, and the accuracy of a good workman doing it that way was genuinely impressive. Later came the pill machine, a grooved brass board with a matching cutter that divided the pipe at one stroke, and it was a revelation when it arrived. Each piece was then rolled between the fingers into a sphere and finished, which meant rolling it in something to stop the pills sticking to one another. Powdered licorice was common, and gave a dark, handsome pill. Lycopodium, the spore powder of the club moss, was better still, a fine pale dust that coats without adding anything. And in the shops that served the wealthy, some pills were silvered or gilded until they shone, which added nothing to the medicine, and a great deal to the bill, and which everybody involved understood perfectly. Then boluses, which were simply large soft pills, too big to swallow whole comfortably, made to be taken in a spoonful of something, and used where a quantity of powder had to be got into a patient at once. Then powders, which were the simplest thing in the shop to make and the fiddliest to finish. A powder was divided into individual doses on the tile, and each dose was folded into a small paper. There was a correct way, which produced a flat rectangular packet with the ends tucked in, so that nothing escaped, and so that the paper could be opened by a patient in bed without spilling. An apprentice folded thousands of them, and it was the sort of task by which an older man could judge, in 3 seconds, how careful that boy was. Then the wet preparations, which were the largest part of the shop's output by volume. Syrups, made by dissolving sugar in a water or a juice or an infusion, and boiling to a set thickness, which was tested by the way a drop behaved on a cold plate, and by the thread it drew between finger and thumb. Too thin, and it fermented in the jar within a month. Too thick, and it granulated into a solid mass that had to be melted down again. Conserves, which were fresh flowers or leaves beaten in a mortar, with several times their weight of sugar, until they formed a smooth paste, and of which conserve of roses was the great one, made in quantity every summer. Electuaries, which were powders worked up with honey or syrup into a soft paste, to be taken by the spoonful, and which were how most of the great compound medicines of the age were actually delivered, and juleps and draughts and mixtures made up fresh while the customer waited. Then the external things which were made in bulk and kept. Ointments, which were medicinal substances worked into a fatty base of lard or soot, sometimes with wax to stiffen them. The making was done cold in a mortar, with a great deal of patient work, and the test of a good one was that it was perfectly smooth, with no grittiness at all under the finger. Plasters, which were the most physical work on the bench. A plaster was a stiff adhesive mass often based on lead compounds boiled for hours with oil until the whole turned to a pale grey putty, and the boiling of one went on all afternoon with constant stirring. The finished mass was worked like toffee while warm, rolled into sticks and stored. When one was wanted, a piece was cut, warmed, and spread on leather with a heated spatula, and the spreading of a plaster evenly, right to the edge, without ridges, was one of the tests by which a young man's handiwork was judged. Then the small sugar work, which the apothecary shared with the confectioner. Lozenges, made by working powdered sugar with gum and a little flavor into a paste, rolling it flat, cutting it and drying it on paper for a day. And comfits, which were seeds coated in successive layers of sugar in a swinging pan. An operation that took hours and produced the sugared aniseed that was as much a sweetmeat as a medicine. And finally, once everything was made, the packaging, which was not an afterthought. Every item that left the shop was wrapped, tied, sealed and labeled. Bottles were corked, and the cork covered with a paper cap tied down with thread. Ointment pots had a paper or a bladder tied over the mouth. Pills went into a small round chip box of thin shaved wood, which was the standard container of the trade for centuries. The label was written by hand, and increasingly, as the century went on a printed slip carrying the shop's name and its sign. It gave the direction for taking, in English plainly, because the patient had to be able to follow it. A shop with a good hand on its labels was a shop that looked competent, and an apprentice with poor handwriting was set to practice it in the evenings until it improved. And then, once or twice in an apprenticeship, there was the great compounding, which was an event rather than a task. The medicine in question was theriac, or one of its near relations, and it stood at the very top of the profession's idea of itself. It was an inheritance from the ancient world, a compound of a great many ingredients, 60 or 70 in some versions, worked together with honey into a dark aromatic electuary, and it was believed to be effective against poisons, bites, pestilential fevers, and a long list of other things besides. Its reputation was enormous and had been for 1,500 years, making it was a considerable undertaking. Every ingredient had to be obtained and had to be genuine, because the whole point of the medicine was that it was complete. Everything was prepared, powdered, sifted, weighed. And then the whole was worked together, over hours, in the largest mortar in the house, by whoever had the strongest arms, which is to say by the apprentices in rotation. In the great cities of the continent, this was done in public. In Venice, most famously, the making of theriac was a civic ceremony carried out in front of the shop, with the ingredients laid out on a table for anyone to inspect, with officials of the guild and the city present to certify that nothing had been left out or substituted. The point was trust, and it was made theatrically because trust in a medicine of that price had to be visible. In London it was quieter, but the principle held. Afterwards, the finished mass was put up in a covered jar and left to mature, sometimes for years, because it was held that the medicine improved in the keeping. For an apprentice, this was one of the few days in the calendar when the whole house did one thing together, and it is remembered in the accounts with something close to affection, despite the arms. The whole of this bench work has a quality that comes through very strongly in the old manuals, and it is worth naming. Everything was judged by appearance. A well-made pill was round, even, uniform in size, and neatly finished. A well-made plaster was smooth and evenly spread. A syrup was bright and clear. A powder paper was crisp. None of this had the slightest effect on whether the medicine worked, and all of it mattered enormously, because the appearance of the article was the only evidence a customer had of the care taken in making it. That is the standard the apprentice was held to hour after hour from his 3rd year onward, and it is why the 7 years were 7 years. Let us turn now, since the afternoon has run on, and the household will want feeding, to the other half of his life, which was not the shop at all. He lived in the house. That single fact shaped everything about his existence in a way that is easy to underestimate, because it meant that he did not go home from work. There was no home to go to and no work to leave. The building was both, and the people in it were, for 7 years, his family in the practical sense, whether he liked them or not. The household of a comfortable London apothecary might contain the master and his wife, their children, 1 or 2 apprentices, a journeyman if the shop was busy, a maidservant, and sometimes a lodger or an elderly relative. 10 or 12 people in a narrow building of 3 or 4 floors, sharing 1 fire in the kitchen and 1 stair. He ate at the master's table, and this was not a courtesy, but a term of the indenture. What that meant in practice varied enormously, and was one of the chief measures by which apprentices judged their luck. The food of a prosperous city household in that century was substantially better than what most of the country ate. Bread, a good deal of it. Meat several times a week, boiled more often than roasted, cheese, butter, pottage and broths, fish on the traditional days, which persisted long after the religious reasons for them had loosened, puddings, small beer with every meal, at every hour, for everyone including the children, because it was safer than the water and nobody thought twice about it. The seating had a strict geography, the master at the head, his wife opposite or beside him, the children next, the journeyman, and the apprentices at the bottom of the table, served last, taking what came round to them. This was not intended as humiliation. It was simply the shape of an ordered household in a century that thought in ranks, and a boy who arrived expecting anything else was quickly educated. Meals were also where the day was reviewed. What had come in? Who had called? What the boy had got wrong that morning, discussed openly with the whole table listening, which was mortifying at 15 and useful at 19. His clothing was frequently provided, and it too was written into the agreement. In many indentures the master undertook to keep the apprentice in apparel for the whole term, which meant a working suit, a coat, shirts, stockings, shoes, and the replacement of these as they wore out. In the older tradition, apprentices had worn a distinctive plain dress, flat caps, and blue coats, and although that was fading through the 17th century, the general expectation remained that a bound lad dressed soberly and did not go about the town, got up like a gentleman. Complaints about apprentices dressing above their station appear regularly, and are usually a good sign that the apprentices were doing exactly that. His money was almost nothing. He was not paid a wage. What he had came from small allowances, from tips given by grateful customers, from the traditional gifts at certain times of year, and from whatever his family sent. In the later years of a term, some masters gave a small sum quarterly, partly from decency, and partly from the sensible recognition that a young man of 20 with no money at all in his pocket is a young man with a reason to steal. His time was the master's, in principle, from waking to sleeping every day but Sunday. Sunday was church, and the whole household went together. Attendance was not optional, and the master was answerable for it. The rest of Sunday was, by custom rather than by right, quieter. And it was when letters home were written, when a boy might walk out with the other apprentices of the street, when he might visit an uncle across the city, if he had one. The other holidays were fixed and were looked forward to for months. The 12 days of Christmas, when even a strict household eased. Easter, Whitsun, and the great annual festival of apprentices everywhere, Shrove Tuesday, which in London had long since become a day when the young men of the trades came out into the streets in numbers and made a considerable nuisance of themselves. The authorities of the city complained about it in more or less identical language for 200 years, which tells you how effective the complaints were. There were also the great days of the society itself. The election of the master and wardens, the annual feast, the ceremonies at the hall. An apprentice was not a member and did not attend the dinner, but he served at it, carried for it, and stood at the back of it, and he watched the men he would one day be among. The master's children occupied a strange middle position in all this. They lived in the same house, ate at the same table, and were, in the ordinary run of things, his companions. But they were also the master's children, and a boy who quarrelled with one of them was in a losing argument before it began. Where there was a son of about the same age, who was being brought into the trade himself, the arrangement could be genuinely awkward, since the two of them were doing the same work in the same room, with entirely different futures ahead of them. And where there was a daughter of about the same age, the marriage clause in the indenture acquired a very sharp practical meaning, and a good many apprentices discovered exactly why the trades had bothered to write it down. It is also true that a substantial number of apothecaries in every generation ended up marrying into the family of the man who had taught them, once the term was safely over, and that this was regarded by everybody as an excellent and sensible arrangement. The other apprentices were the closest thing he had to friends. In a shop with 2 or 3, the older instructed and tormented the younger in roughly equal measure, and the hierarchy among them was absolute and entirely informal. The boy in his 6th year did not sweep. The boy in his 1st year swept and fetched, and was sent on errands invented purely to get him out of the room, and was told a great many things about the trade that were completely untrue, and passed all of it on faithfully to the next boy who arrived beneath him. The apprentices of the street were a wider society again. They knew each other, ran messages between shops, met at the conduit while waiting for water, and formed the loose, noisy, occasionally troublesome fraternity that every city in Europe knew and every city magistrate distrusted. And the master's wife occupied a position in all this that the formal documents barely acknowledge, and that mattered a very great deal. She ran the household. She frequently ran a good part of the shop as well, since the still room work and the sugar work and the conserves were traditionally women's crafts, and many an apothecary's wife knew them better than her husband. She nursed the apprentices when they were ill, which they were, and she decided, in the daily way that such things are decided, whether a house was a bearable place for a homesick boy of 15 or an unbearable one. Apprentices who wrote about their years afterwards remember her as often as they remember the master, and usually more warmly. Two other things belong to this part of his life, and they are easy to pass over. The first is illness. Apprentices got ill, and they got ill in a household full of medicine, which is not the same as a household full of cure. The fevers of a crowded city went through a house like that in a week. A boy who took to his bed was nursed there, dosed with whatever the shop believed in, and expected back at the counter as soon as he could stand. In a decent house this was done with real kindness. In a poor house it was resented as an interruption, and in a period when a fever could go either way in 3 days, being ill in somebody else's house at 15, a long way from a mother, was one of the loneliest experiences the whole term offered. The second is homesickness, which the documents almost never mention, and which must have been everywhere. A boy came from a family, sometimes from a village 50 or 100 miles off, and he did not go back. Travel was slow and expensive, and his time was not his own. He might see his parents once a year, or once in 3 years, or not at all. What he had were letters, written slowly and carried by whoever happened to be going that way, and the occasional appearance of an uncle or a cousin passing through the city on business, which was an event looked forward to for months. The trade knew this in its practical way, and dealt with it in the manner of the age, which was to keep him busy. The remedy for a homesick apprentice was work, and there was a great deal of it. And by the 2nd year the shop had become the place he thought of when he thought of home, which was in the end exactly what the 7 years were designed to achieve. Let us turn now to the streets outside, and to the errands that took him out of the house. A great deal of what an apothecary sold did not leave in a customer's hand. It left in an apprentice's basket, and went out into the city on foot. The deliveries were constant, and they had their own rhythm through the day. There were the things ordered in the morning, and wanted by noon. There were the standing arrangements, the households that took the same preparation every week, and expected it to arrive without being asked for. There were the urgent ones, sent for by a servant who stood in the shop shifting from foot to foot while it was made up. And there were the ones the master carried himself, because they were going to a house whose custom he particularly valued, or because he intended to look at the patient while he was there. The basket was covered, always with a cloth over it, partly for the weather, and the weather in that city was a serious professional consideration, partly because bottles and pots travelled badly in the open, and partly for discretion, because a boy walking through the streets with a visible cargo of medicine was a boy advertising to the whole neighborhood exactly who was ill and what they were taking. And a shop that would lose its customers within a season. He learned the city with his feet, and he learned it in a way that nobody who rides ever learns a place. The London he crossed was a dense, close-built, endlessly busy warren, and it was not laid out on any plan whatever. Streets ran where they had always run, which was frequently along the line of a medieval field boundary or a vanished stream. Lanes turned back on themselves, courts and yards opened off through archways so narrow that a laden porter had to turn sideways. There were no numbers on the houses to speak of, and so directions were given entirely by landmark and by sign. Past the bell, then down the lane beside the church, the third door after the sign of the 3 tons, the house with the blue shutters. Ask for the widow on the 2nd floor. Underfoot it was filthy in the way that all cities were filthy before drains. The kennel ran down the middle of the street, carrying whatever had been put into it. Overhanging upper stories kept the lanes in permanent shade and dripped for hours after rain had stopped. There were animals everywhere, horses and carts, and drovers taking livestock through to the markets. There were carriages that expected the street to make way for them. And there was the constant risk, in a city where a great deal was still thrown from windows, of an experience nobody in any century has enjoyed. He learned the walking rules that every city boy learned. Keep to the wall side, where it is drier. Give way to porters carrying, because they cannot stop. Do not run in a crowded lane with glass in your basket. The city also spoke to him constantly, because it was an age before printed advertising had taken over and everything was cried aloud. The street sellers each had their own call, worn smooth by repetition, and a Londoner could identify a dozen trades from indoors without looking up. Milk oysters, brooms mackerel, hot pies, old clothes, small coal, chairs to mend, knives to grind. Water carriers. Ballad singers with the sheets pinned to a pole. The noise of that city was one of the things visitors from abroad wrote home about most often. The houses he delivered to varied as widely as the city itself. At the top end were the households of merchants and gentlemen, where he went to the back door, never the front, and handed the parcel to a servant, and was occasionally, if it was cold and the cook was kind, given something warm before being sent on his way. These accounts ran on credit and were settled quarterly, and the apprentice's only involvement was to make sure the delivery was recorded properly. In the middle were the tradesmen's houses, where a wife came to the door herself, took the bottle, asked a question about how it was to be given, and expected the boy to be able to answer it. This is where an apprentice discovered whether he had actually been paying attention at the counter, because a woman with a sick child does not accept the answer that one does not know, and at the bottom were the rooms. Whole families in a single chamber, up 2 flights of dark stairs, with the window stuffed against the draught and the air thick. This is where the boy saw what illness actually looked like when there was no money in the house, and it is the part of an apprenticeship that changed people. He came in with a small bottle and a paper of powders. He saw the room. He set the medicine down and gave the direction, and went back out into the street. And the whole of that transaction took 90 seconds, and he thought about it for the rest of the day. A good many apothecaries carried debts on their books that everybody involved knew would never be paid, and a good many wrote them off quietly at the year's end. That, too, the apprentice noticed. There were other errands, and they were the ones that made an apprentice useful in a way no manual describes. He was sent to other apothecaries. This happened all the time and was entirely normal. No shop carried everything, and when a bill called for something that had run out, or that this house did not stock, a boy went round to a neighbor with a note and came back with an ounce of it, and the two masters settled it between them later. This was one of the quiet strengths of a trade concentrated in one quarter of a city, and it is why the apothecaries clustered together in the same few streets rather than spreading out to avoid one another. He was sent to the physicians to carry a query about a bill, to take a note, to wait in a hall while a busy man finished with somebody else, and to bring the answer back exactly, without embroidery, because a message repeated wrongly could cost the shop a relationship worth a good deal of money. He was sent to the wharves when a consignment came in. The drugs of the world arrived by ship, and somebody had to go and see them carted and check the parcels against what had been ordered. For a boy in his 5th or 6th year, this was an outing and an education at once, because it put him next to the merchants and the porters and the smell of a warehouse full of things from 4 continents. The weather governed all of it, and the weather in that city was mostly against him. Rain turned the lanes to a paste that came in over the top of a shoe. Wind took the hat off a boy, carrying a covered basket in both hands, and he had a choice to make about which he valued more: fog. And the fogs of a coal-burning city were something beyond what the word suggests now, could close a street to the length of an arm and turn a walk he had made 300 times into a slow feeling along walls. And in winter it was dark by 4 in the afternoon, and the streets had no lighting worth the name beyond what fell out of a window or was carried in someone's hand. Householders were required by ancient custom to hang out a light on certain nights, and the requirement was honored about as thoroughly as such requirements usually are. A boy out late with a delivery carried a lantern with a candle in it and kept to the middle of streets he did not trust. He was also, being young and unarmed and visibly carrying something, a natural target. Not often, and not usually with any great violence, but a basket snatched at a corner was a thing that happened. And a boy who lost one lost stock, which meant a conversation at home that he would have preferred to avoid. So he learned the streets to keep out of after dark, and he learned to walk behind a group going the same way, and he learned to come home a longer way rather than a quicker one, which is a lesson that every city has taught every apprentice it ever had. There is one more category, and it belongs here. He was sent, in his later years, to sit with patients. This was not universal, and in the strict division of the medical world it was not properly his business, but in practice it happened constantly. An apothecary who was treating a household sent his apprentice to look in, to see whether the medicine had answered, to change a dressing, to report back. It was cheaper than the master going himself, and the master went himself if the report was worrying. For the apprentice it was the closest he came to clinical practice during his term, and it taught him, more than any book could, the difference between a patient who is mending and a patient who is not. Let us turn now to the days when the shop's business was not in the city at all, but out beyond it, in the fields. Not everything in the drawers came from a ship. A very great deal of it grew within a morning's walk of the shop door, and the trade in fresh and locally dried material had its own calendar, its own suppliers, and its own particular days. The chief suppliers were the herb women, and they deserved to be better remembered than they are. These were women, frequently from the villages just outside the city, who gathered wild plants and grew garden ones and brought them in to sell. They came in with baskets on their heads and on their backs before dawn, and they sold in the markets and at the doors of the shops. They knew the plants absolutely. They knew where a particular one grew in quantity, which bank on which side of which hill, and at what week of which month it was worth cutting. They knew what an apothecary wanted and what he would reject. An apprentice sent to buy from them was sent into a negotiation he would lose for the first 2 years. They knew the trade far better than he did. They knew he was new, and they priced accordingly. His master expected him to be beaten at first, and expected him to stop being beaten. And the process of learning to look at a basket of fresh herb and say quietly that half of it was past its best, and he would give a certain price for the rest, was one of the small hard educations of the term. The market itself was one of the great scenes of the city. The herb market, wherever it sat in a given town, was noisy, crowded, competitive, and over by the middle of the morning. Everything was sold by the bunch or the basket. Everything was fresh and would not keep, and the whole thing had to be done at speed and in the dark of the early hours. Then there were the collecting days that the shop did for itself, and these were the ones the apprentices genuinely enjoyed. Certain things a careful master would not buy from anybody because he wanted to see them cut himself. Certain things had to be gathered at a particular moment and used almost at once. And certain things were simply cheaper to walk out and get. So on a fine morning in the season, the shop shut early or opened late, and the master and the journeymen and the apprentices went out of the city on foot with baskets and knives and a bag of bread and cheese. The rules of gathering were old and were largely sound. Leaves before the plant flowered, when its strength was still in them. Flowers just as they opened, not after. Roots in the autumn after the top had died down, or in the very early spring before it rose, when the goodness was in the ground and not in the air. Barks in spring when they lifted cleanly, seeds when they were ripe and dry and would rattle. Everything cut on a dry day, after the dew had lifted and before the sun was high, because material gathered wet would mowed in the loft, and material gathered in the heat of the day had lost part of its scent to the air. And the great rule underneath all of them, which every teacher of the craft repeated: be certain of the plant. There were species that resembled one another closely, and among them were several that would kill, and an armful of the wrong umbelliferous plant taken by a confident boy who had not looked at the root was a genuine and recurring disaster of the herbal trade. So the identification was taught in the field, plant by plant, over years. The master crushed a leaf and held it out to be smelled. He turned it over to show the underside. He pointed at the stem, whether it was round or square or grooved or hollow, whether it was hairy, and in which direction the hairs lay. He dug one up to show the root. The apprentice was made to say the name before he was told it, and was corrected, and said it again the next year, and by his 6th year he was the one holding out the crushed leaf to the boy who had arrived last spring. The Society of Apothecaries turned this practice into an institution, and it is one of the most attractive things it ever did. From early in its life it organized herborizing days, on which the members and their apprentices went out together into the countryside around London to botanize. They went to the heaths and the commons and the river banks, to Hampstead and Battersea and Putney and Chelsea, and out along the Kentish side. There were smaller outings through the season, and a great general one in the summer, and the day ended, by long tradition, with a dinner. It was serious teaching, and it was also, unmistakably, a good day out. The accounts that survive have a distinct holiday feeling about them, of men and boys walking out of a smoky city into open country in June, with a professional excuse for doing so. And in 1673 the Society took a lease on a piece of ground beside the river at Chelsea and made a garden of it, so that the plants a young apothecary needed to know could be grown, named and studied in one place all year round, instead of hunted for across 3 counties. The Society kept a barge, and the barge went up the river to the garden, and apprentices went with it. That garden is still there, and it has been growing medicinal plants continuously ever since, which makes it one of the longest unbroken threads running from that boy's world into ours. What came home from all these expeditions went straight up to the drying loft. Drying was the whole art of preserving a herb, and it was done in the roof space where the air moved and the light did not reach. Bunches were tied loosely, never tightly, because a tight bunch heats in the middle and spoils. They were hung heads downward from lines and beams. Roots were washed, sliced if they were thick, and spread on trays or on frames of netting. Flowers were laid out in single layers and turned by hand. The enemies were damp, heat, and light. Damp brought mood, which ruined a whole crop and could not be got out. Heat drove off the volatile parts, which is the very thing that was wanted. So nothing worth having was ever dried in front of a fire, if it could be helped. And sunlight bleached the color and took the virtue with it. A properly dried herb kept its color. That was the test, and it is still the test. Green herbs should come out of the loft green, not brown, and should snap rather than bend, and should smell like themselves when crushed. An apprentice was sent up to that loft twice a day, through the drying season, to turn things over, to feel them, to take down what was ready and bring it to the shop for stripping and storing. When a thing was dry it came down, and then it had to be prepared for storage, which was another set of small tasks with the apprentice's name on them. Leaves were stripped from their stems, because the stems were bulk without virtue. Flowers were picked from their calices. Roots were cut into pieces of a size that would go into a mortar without a fight. Seeds were rubbed out of their heads and winnowed, which was done by pouring them from one bowl to another in a draught until the chaff had gone. And then everything was put away in the drawer, or the box, or the canvas bag that belonged to it, with the year written somewhere, because a shop that could not tell this season's stock from last season's would be selling hay within 2 years. The whole cycle took the summer, and it happened again the next summer, and by his 4th or 5th turn round it, the apprentice had stopped thinking of the herbs as items on a list and had started thinking of them as a calendar. Elderflower meant June. Roses meant midsummer. The roots meant that the year was closing. He had, without noticing, acquired the countryman's habit of knowing where he was in the year by what was ready. The loft in August, warm under the tiles, full of hanging bunches, with the whole summer's gathering breathing out at once, is one of the images the old apothecaries return to when they write about their youth. It smells, in every account, like the best part of the work. Let us turn now, since not every part of the work was good, to the things that went wrong. Things went wrong constantly, and most of them were small. And the small ones are the ones that fill an apprentice's memory. He broke things. This is first on every list because it was first in every shop. A glass carboy carried up from the cellar with wet hands. A shop round taken down from a high shelf one, handed because he was in a hurry. The finest jars were the ones displayed highest, which is to say the ones most likely to be reached for badly. And every apprentice in Europe knew the particular silence that follows the sound of good delftware hitting a stone floor. He spilled things. A powder scattered off a tile by a draught from the door. A syrup jar tipped, a measure overfilled. The loss was rarely large in itself, but the loss was money, and a shop kept its accounts closely. He mislabeled things, or failed to label them at all, and this was in a different category altogether. An unlabeled bottle on a bench was not an untidiness. It was, potentially, the beginning of something very serious indeed, and the rule against it was enforced with a severity that a boy did not understand until the day it was explained to him properly by somebody who had seen the consequence. He forgot errands. He came back from a delivery, having omitted to collect the answer he had been sent for. He gave a direction to a customer that was very nearly right, and in the still room he let fires go out and let them get away from him, which is the more frightening of the two. A distillation run too hot cracks a glass vessel, and a cracked vessel over a fire is a spillage of hot spirit next to a naked flame in a wooden building. Fire was the terror of every city household of that century, and an apprentice who fell asleep beside a still was committing an offense that his master regarded as being of an entirely different order from breaking a jar. Punishment for all of this was physical and was accepted as ordinary. A cuff, a blow, a beating with whatever came to hand, administered by the master as a father might administer it, and considered by the law to be within his rights so long as it was moderate. What moderate meant was, of course, the whole question. And it was the question that the courts and the companies actually had to deal with, because the line was crossed often enough to leave a paper trail. And here is one of the genuinely interesting things about this system. An apprentice was not without recourse. The indenture was a contract, and it bound both parties, and a master who failed his side of it could be brought to account. An apprentice who was starved, who was beaten beyond what the custom allowed, who was not being taught the trade at all, but merely used as a servant, could complain. He could complain to his company, which had jurisdiction over its members and a real interest in the reputation of the trade. He could complain to a magistrate, and the records of the city companies contain a steady trickle of exactly these cases, running for centuries. The outcomes varied. Often the master was admonished and the apprentice sent back. Sometimes the boy was transferred and his indenture was turned over to another master, which was the usual remedy in a serious case. And occasionally the indenture was cancelled outright and the premium, or part of it, ordered to be returned. The reverse happened too, and more often, with masters bringing complaints for idleness, for theft, for insolence, for haunting the very taverns the document had forbidden. The commonest of all was absence, and the extreme form of absence was running away. Runaway apprentices were a standing feature of city life. The newspapers of the later part of the century carry the notices in a distinctive flat style. A description of the young man, his height, his hair, his complexion, the clothes he wore when he went, sometimes a note about a scar or a manner of speaking. A statement of what he had taken with him, if anything, a reward for information, and a warning to all persons not to employ or harbour him, which had legal force, because taking on another man's bound apprentice was itself an offence. Some ran because they were treated badly. Some ran because they had come to the wrong trade and could not bear another 4 years of it. Some ran to sea, which was the great absorber of restless young men in that century, and asked no questions about indentures. Some ran and came back within the week, having discovered what a city does to a 15-year-old with no money and no place to sleep, and were taken back with the time added to their term. Then there were the failures that belonged to the trade itself rather than to any individual, and the chief of these was bad stock. The Society of Apothecaries had, from its foundation, the power of search. This was one of the reasons it had wanted independence in the first place, and it used the power seriously. The master and wardens, with a small party, could enter any apothecary's shop within their jurisdiction and inspect what was in it. They looked at the drugs and the compound medicines. They compared what they found against the standard, and where they found things that were adulterated, decayed, or made otherwise than the pharmacopoeia directed, they could seize them and destroy them. The destruction was public, and it was meant to be. Condemned drugs were carried out and burned in the street in front of the shop, which is about as pointed a piece of professional discipline as any trade has devised. A master who had a search go badly did not merely lose stock. He lost standing in a street where everybody had seen the fire. For the apprentice, the search was an event of high anxiety and considerable interest. He had done a good deal of the work of keeping that stock in order. If something on the shelves was found to be past its virtue, the question of who had last turned out that drawer was going to arise. The other institutional failure was money, and it broke more apothecaries than bad practice ever did. The trade ran on credit in both directions. The shop bought its drugs from wholesale druggists and merchants on terms, and it sold to its customers on terms, and the gap between those two sets of terms was where a business lived or died. Wealthy households paid slowly. Some paid very slowly indeed, and a genteel debtor was almost impossible to press, because pressing him meant losing him and losing everyone he recommended. Meanwhile, the merchant who had supplied the parcel of senna wanted his money. Apothecaries went bankrupt regularly. Shops closed. Stock was sold off, and the fine jars that had cost a young man his savings went at auction for a fraction of what they had been worth, to be carried away to somebody else's shelves. An apprentice in a failing house was in a genuinely difficult position, and the system had an answer for it. If a master died or became insolvent, the indenture was turned over, and the remainder of the term served with another apothecary, often arranged through the society. It was a real safety net, but it meant starting again in a strange house halfway through, with the years already served counting on paper, and counting for rather less at a new kitchen table. And then there were the troubles that came from outside the trade altogether, from the people who sold medicine without having served any term at all. They were everywhere, and they always had been. The mountebank set up his stage in a market square with a tumbler or a fool to gather the crowd, and sold a bottle of his own preparation with a speech that promised rather more than any apothecary would dare put in writing. The printers of the city turned out handbills for proprietary medicines by the thousand. And in every neighborhood there were the unlicensed sellers, the grocers, and the chandlers and the widows, keeping a shelf of common remedies beside the candles and the soap. The society disliked all of this intensely and pursued what it could. Its jurisdiction covered the city and a radius around it, and within that ground it could and did prosecute people for practicing the art of the apothecary without having served an apprenticeship or been admitted. It searched their stock and condemned it and fined them. Whether this was public protection or trade protection is a fair question, and the honest answer is that it was both at once. A man selling colored water as a cure for consumption was a genuine danger. A widow selling the same 3 sensible household remedies her mother had sold at a price the poor could actually pay was a competitor rather than a menace, and the enthusiasm with which she was pursued did not always reflect the difference. And there were the accidents that had nothing to do with fault at all. Masters died, wives died, children died, and in a house where an apprentice had been living for 4 years, that was a grief he shared. The plague and the fevers of the city did not distinguish between the family and the boy at the bottom of the table. Let us turn now to the end of the day, and to the part of it that nobody outside the trade ever saw. The shutters went up at dusk, or a little after, depending on the season and the neighborhood. The same boards that had come down that morning were lifted back into place and barred from the inside, and the shop went dark, and the sounds of the lane outside changed as the trade of the street packed itself away. Then came the closing round, which we have already walked once, and which was done every night without fail. Lids on, stoppers home, the balance put away in its case, the counter wiped down, the mortar scoured and dried, the tools cleaned and laid where they belonged, because a bench found in disorder in the morning cost time, and time in the morning was the scarcest thing in the house. The day book was made up. Whatever had gone out on credit that day was entered properly, in ink, in a legible hand, with the date. In many shops this was done by the master, in a good many others by the senior apprentice, and it was one of the responsibilities that marked out a young man who was trusted. And then, in most houses, came the part of the evening that belonged to instruction. This is the piece of the apprenticeship most easily lost from view, because it left almost no records at all. The teaching of the trade did not happen in classes. It happened in the hour or two after the shop closed, in a room with a candle, with a boy and an older man and a book, and it happened for 7 years. The reading came first, and there was a great deal of it. The pharmacopoeia, gone through formula by formula, translated aloud, discussed. The herbals, of which every shop had 2 or 3, and which were read as much for the pictures as for the text, because a woodcut of a plant seen 100 times becomes a plant recognized in a hedge. The dispensatories, which explained not merely what to make, but why the ingredients went together as they did. The Latin was drilled, because the Latin was going to be examined at the end. Not conversation and not poetry, but the specific working Latin of prescriptions and formulae, endings, cases, the forms of the verbs used in directions. An apprentice with a good grammar school behind him found this easy, and an apprentice without one found it the hardest thing in his whole term. And the second kind existed in numbers and got through by sheer repetition in the evenings. And there was the questioning, which is the part every apprentice remembered. The master, or the journeyman, holding up something from a drawer without a word, and waiting. Name it. Where does it come from? What part of the plant is this? How would you know a bad one? What is it used for? In what preparations does it appear? What is the dose? What must it never be given with? Over and over, night after night, year after year, until the answers came without thought. Not every evening was given to books, and it would be a false picture to suggest it was. There were evenings when the master was out, or tired, or had company, and the hour after the shutters went up simply belonged to the apprentices. What they did with it was what young men in cities have always done with an unsupervised hour. They talked. They played at cards, quietly, in defiance of a clause they had all signed, and none of them had ever taken seriously. They went out into the lane to stand about with the apprentices of the neighboring shops, which was permitted in some houses and forbidden in others, and happened in both. And a certain number of them went to the alehouse, which was forbidden absolutely and everywhere, and which was consequently one of the most common causes of trouble in the whole system. A boy who came in late smelling of beer, in a house where every person on the stairs could hear every other, was a boy whose next morning was going to be memorable. There were also the evenings when he simply read for himself. This turns up in more than one apothecary's later account, and it has a wistfulness about it. The shop had books. The books were about the natural world at a moment when the natural world was being described afresh by a whole generation of curious people, and a boy who had been given a herbal to study for his examination sometimes found himself reading it long after the required page, by a candle he was not strictly entitled to burn, simply because it was interesting. That is where a good many of the better apothecaries came from. Not from the discipline, which produced competence, but from the accident of a young man in a warm room discovering that he actually wanted to know. Then, at last, the house went up to bed, and the boy either climbed to the garret with the others or, in the smaller houses, pulled the truckle bed out from under the counter and lay down in the shop. And sometimes, in the middle of that night, somebody knocked. The night call is one of the constants of the trade in every century. Illness does not observe shop hours, and an apothecary's door in a residential quarter was the nearest thing to a hospital that most of the neighborhood had. A child worsening at 2 in the morning, a man in pain who had held out all evening hoping it would pass, a woman in labor and a midwife sending for something, an accident, a fever turning. The knocking woke whoever was nearest, and whoever was nearest was almost always the apprentice. It is one of the reasons a shop kept a boy sleeping downstairs at all. And it was understood by everybody in the house to be part of what the 7 years brought. He went to the door with a candle. He listened to whoever was standing there in the dark. And by his 3rd or 4th year, He could tell in about 10 seconds which of 3 categories this was. Something he could hand over himself from a drawer he knew, in which case he did, and made a note for the morning. Something that needed making up, in which case he lit the lamp and did it slowly and carefully, because the rule about weighing by candlelight existed, and he knew it. Or something that needed the master, in which case he went up the stairs and woke him, which was a thing no apprentice ever did lightly, and every apprentice occasionally had to do. The nights when the master came down in his gown and went out into the street with his hat on and did not come back until dawn were the nights that told a boy what the trade actually was. And somebody was very ill somewhere in the parish, and the man who taught him to grind licorice had gone out into the dark to sit with them. There were also the knocks that were not medical at all, and every apprentice learned to sort them too. The neighbor whose own candle had gone out, the watchman checking that a door was barred, the drunk who had mistaken the house, and once or twice in a term, the knock that was somebody testing whether the shop was occupied, which is why a boy at the door in the small hours answered through it rather than opening it, and why the bar stayed across until he knew the voice. In houses that had them, there was a bell on a wire beside the door, and it rang somewhere inside where the sleeper was, which spared the whole street the sound of hammering at 2 in the morning. It is a small piece of civility, and it spread through the trade over the following century, until a night bell was simply what a chemist's door had, in the way that a mortar was what hung above it. What is worth holding on to about all this is how ordinary it was. The trade did not think of the night call as heroic and did not describe it in those terms. It was simply understood that a shop of this kind was answerable at any hour, and that the price of being the place a neighborhood came to us that the neighborhood came at 3 in the morning as readily as at 3 in the afternoon. And then the door was barred again, and the candle was put out, and the shop settled back into the particular quiet of a room full of jars, and the boy lay down, and in 3 or 4 hours it would be time to get up and sweep the floor. Let us turn now to the hardest seasons of all, the ones the whole city remembered. There were years in that century that everyone who lived through them measured the rest of their lives against, and if our apprentice was in London through the middle of the 1660s, he lived through 2 of them back to back. The first was the plague year of 1665. It came, as such things had come to the city many times before, in the spring, in the poorer parishes outside the walls, and it grew through a hot summer until it was everywhere. The bills of mortality, which the city had been printing weekly for decades, were read in every shop, and through July and August the numbers on them climbed into figures that no living person had seen. The wealthy left. That is the first fact of the story, and it is not a small one. Those who had a country house or a relative in a market town went to them, and the roads out of the city were busy with carts. The court left, and, notoriously, a great many physicians left as well, which is a fact that the apothecaries of London remembered for a very long time afterwards, and which they were still bringing up in their disputes with the college a generation later. A shop, however, cannot leave. A shop is a room full of stock and a lease and a trade built on being in that street. And so a great many apothecaries stayed, and kept their doors open, and went on selling medicine to a population that was terrified and dying, and some of them died doing it. What they sold was, in the main, useless against that particular disease, and it is important to say so plainly and without mockery, because they did not know it and could not have known it. The remedies of the time were the remedies of the humoral system, and they were applied with real seriousness. Preparations to strengthen the heart, cordials. Theriac and mithridate, the great compound medicines, believed to be sovereign against poisons and pestilences alike, and sold in enormous quantity that year. Preparations of a bitter root, much recommended for pestilential fevers. Things to provoke sweating, on the reasoning that the disease had to be driven out through the skin, and a very great deal of fumigation and of aromatics, because the whole understanding of contagion rested on bad air. The air was believed to carry it, and so the answer to bad air was strong air. Rooms were fumigated with burning resins and juniper and sulfur. People carried nosegays and pomanders, and the pomander, a perforated ball of silver or of ivory holding a paste of aromatic gums, was the single most visible object of that summer. Vinegar was everywhere, because vinegar was thought to correct the air, and money was passed to shopkeepers through bowls of it. The apothecaries made all of this, day after day, and the apprentices ground it. They also did something else, which was less remarked at the time and matters more. They stayed at the counter. In a city where the physicians who could afford to leave had largely gone, the man in the shop on the corner became, for those months, the only medical advice available to an entire neighborhood. People came in and described their symptoms and were listened to, and were told, honestly in many cases, what could and could not be done. Some apothecaries wrote about it afterwards. The accounts are calm and flat and very tired. The city that summer emptied of ordinary sound. Grass was said to grow in some of the streets. The carts came at night with a bell. Houses where the sickness had been found were shut up with a painted mark on the door and a watchman set outside, with everyone inside kept in, well or ill, for 40 days, which was as cruel a policy as it sounds, and which drove people to escape through back windows in numbers that made it largely ineffective. An apprentice going out with a basket that summer went through streets like that. There is no way to make that a comfortable thing to describe, and there is no need to dwell on it either. He went out, he delivered, and he came back, and the shop stayed open. By the winter it had burned itself down, as those epidemics did, and by the spring the city was filling again, and people were beginning to speak of it as something that was over. And in September of the following year the fire came. It started in a bakehouse in a lane near the bridge, in the small hours, at the end of a long dry summer, in a city built of timber with upper stories leaning toward one another across narrow lanes. It burned for 4 days. It took the greater part of the walled city, the cathedral, dozens of churches, and the halls of most of the livery companies, including, among a great many others, the hall of the Society of Apothecaries in Blackfriars, which had been theirs for less than 50 years. For the apothecaries of the city it was, in the most literal sense, a catastrophe of stock. A shop is a building full of dried plant material, oil, spirit, resin, wax and paper. There is nothing in the world more willing to burn. The trade lost premises, stock, records, and in some cases the receipt books that had held the accumulated knowledge of 2 or 3 generations of a family. What people did have was warning, of a sort, because the fire moved over days rather than hours, and so there was time to carry things out. The scenes of that week are well recorded. Carts hired at impossible prices, goods carried to the fields north of the city and piled there. Household after household making the same calculation about what could be saved and what would have to be left. An apothecary making that calculation would have taken, in all likelihood, the day book with the debts in it, the receipt book, the small balance and the weights, the most valuable of the drugs, which meant the smallest and lightest of them, and whatever money was in the house. The jars stayed. The furniture stayed. The Great Mortar, weighing 100 weight and more, certainly stayed, and was found afterwards in the ashes, discolored and cracked but still, being bronze, recognizably itself. Rebuilding took years, and it was done under new rules. The city that went up after the fire was built in brick and stone by order, with wider streets and no more overhanging stories, and the society rebuilt its hall on the same ground in Blackfriars, where it stands to this day. The livery companies mostly did the same. It is one of the reasons that so much of the institutional life of that city has an unbroken line running straight through the middle of the 17th century, despite everything. For an apprentice caught in the middle of these years, the effect on his own small career could be severe and was entirely arbitrary. A master burned out might have to close, and the boy's indenture would be turned over to somebody else. A master who came through with stock intact might find himself busier than ever, because half his competitors had gone. There were other hard seasons too, less famous, and they recurred. The bad winters, when the river froze and fuel prices doubled, and the poor of the city suffered in ways that filled the shop with coughs and chilblains and worse. The summers of flux, when something waterborne went through the crowded parishes and the shop sold nothing but preparations for the bowels for 6 weeks. The years when a harvest failed and the price of grain rose and everyone was hungry and therefore ill, and the smallpox, which was not an event but a permanence, coming round again and again, marking the faces of a substantial fraction of everyone the boy passed in the street. One thing did change, and it is worth noting because it is the kind of consequence nobody plans. The reputation of the apothecaries rose out of those years. They had stayed. The city remembered it, and the trade remembered it about itself. And when the long argument with the physicians came to its head a generation later, in the courts, and in a good deal of pamphleteering on both sides, the fact that the man in the shop had kept his door open in 1665 was not a small part of why the public was on his side. Against all that, the shop went on doing what a shop does. It opened in the morning. Somebody swept the floor. The mortar started up its slow knocking, and along the lane the other mortars answered it, and the day began. Let us turn now, gently, to the last of the 7 years. The change came slowly and mostly without being announced. Somewhere in the 5th or 6th year, the boy stopped being a boy in the eyes of the house. He was no longer sent on the errands invented to get him out of the room. He was left in the shop alone for an hour and then for an afternoon. He was trusted with the day book, and then with the keys, and then, in due course, with the cupboard that was kept locked. new apprentices arrived beneath him, and he found himself doing to them exactly what had been done to him, which is one of the reliable comedies of every trade in every century. He heard himself explaining, in his master's phrases, in something close to his master's tone, how to tell a good senner from a poor one, and he was probably a little startled by it. There was a practical side to this too, and it was not sentimental in the least. An apprentice in his last 2 years was worth a great deal to the household. He knew the stock, he knew the customers, he could be left in charge, and he cost nothing but his food. A master who had spent 5 years teaching a boy was, in the 6th and 7th, finally being repaid, and there is a reason the term was 7 years and not 4. Both sides knew this perfectly well, and it produced a particular atmosphere in the last stretch. Masters who wished to keep a good young man began, quietly, to treat him rather better. Young men who had somewhere else in mind began, equally quietly, to make arrangements, and a certain amount of very careful conversation went on around the edges of the subject for months, without anybody saying anything direct at all. And then the term ran out, and the question of the examination arrived. The Society of Apothecaries examined its candidates itself, through a body of senior members appointed for the purpose, and the examination was not a formality. It was held at the hall. The candidate presented himself, with his indenture and evidence that his term had been properly served, and was examined orally in front of men whose whole professional standing rested on the quality of those they admitted. What they asked him about fell into a few clear areas, and every one of them is something we have walked through tonight. They asked him Latin because the trade ran on it. He was given a physician's bill and asked to read it aloud and to say exactly what it directed and how he would proceed. There is a nice justice in this. 7 years of squinting at bad handwriting across a counter came down, in the end, to reading one more piece of it in a room full of examiners. They asked him materia medica. Substances were put in front of him or named to him, and he was required to identify them, to say where they came from, what part of what plant or animal or mineral they were, how the good was distinguished from the bad, what they were used for and in what quantity. They asked him pharmacy. How is this preparation made? What is the order of operations? What is the proportion? What can go wrong in the making of it, and how is it prevented? What must never be mixed with what? And they asked him, in the general way that examiners have always asked such things, questions designed to find out whether he understood what he was doing or had merely memorized it. Candidates failed. That is worth saying, because it is the thing that made the whole apparatus meaningful. A young man who was not up to it was told to come back, and served longer, and studied, and presented himself again. The society had every incentive to be strict, because every incompetent apothecary practicing under its name damaged every other member of it. But most, having served 7 years in a working shop with a competent master, passed, and then he was made free of the society, which meant he was admitted to its freedom and might practice the art of the apothecary, and in due course keep a shop of his own within the city. The freedom of the city itself generally followed, since a company freedom was the ordinary rote to it, and with it came the rights of a citizen, including the right to trade and, eventually, to vote in the city's elections. There was a fee. There was an oath, sworn before the master and wardens, binding him to deal honestly and to make his medicines according to the book. And there was, in most cases, a dinner, because the companies of that city marked nothing at all without one. It is worth noticing what had happened to him along the way. He had arrived at 15 able to read a little Latin and nothing else. He left at 22 knowing several hundred substances by sight and smell, able to compound and to reckon, able to read a physician's hand, able to stand in a room full of frightened people and speak calmly. None of it had been taught in a classroom, and all of it had been taught. He did not, in the great majority of cases, open a shop the next week. A shop cost money, and he had none. So the ordinary next step was to become a journeyman, which is to say a qualified man working for wages in somebody else's shop. And the word itself comes from the French for a day, because a journeyman was paid by the day. He might stay with his own master, which happened often, and was the comfortable outcome for both. He might go to another shop in the city, or leave London entirely for a town where there were fewer apothecaries, and a shop might be had cheaper. He worked as a journeyman for some years, and he saved, and in time, if things went well, he found a shop to buy or a widow's business to take over or a lease he could manage, and he bought his jars. Not all of them did. That should be said, because the tidy version of this story ends with every young man behind his own counter, and the real one does not. Some stayed journeymen for their whole working lives, competent men in somebody else's shop, and there was no shame attached to it, and not much money either. Some went to sea as ship surgeons or as surgeons' mates, where a knowledge of drugs was wanted and the qualifications asked for were fewer. Some went to the army. Some went out to the colonies, where a man who could compound a medicine was scarce and welcome. Some left the trade entirely, since a freedom of a city company was a valuable thing in itself, and a certain number of apothecaries' apprentices used their 7 years as a ticket into something else altogether, and never touched a pestle again. And some, having married a widow with a shop already standing, walked into a business complete with its jars, its day book, and its customers, on the afternoon of the wedding. This was a well-trodden route in every trade in Europe. But the commonest ending, by a good margin, was the ordinary one. Some years of wages, some years of saving. A lease taken in a street where a shop had fallen vacant. A debt to a druggist for the first stock, and a set of jars bought second-hand from the sale of somebody else's failure. And then, one day, a man came to his door with a boy of 15 and a premium in his pocket and a document written twice on one sheet and cut apart along an indented line. Let us go back one last time to the shop we have spent the night in on the last evening of his term. Everything in that room, by now, is known to him. He can tell you which board of the floor creaks. He knows which drawer sticks in damp weather, and which shelf is a finger's breadth out of true. He knows the mortar so well that he can tell what is in it from the sound of the pestle in the next room. 200 Latin words that meant nothing to him at 15 are simply the names of things he handles every day. He takes the shutters up for the last time as an apprentice. He does the closing round, lids on, stoppers home, the balance in its case, the leech jar covered, the cloth pulled taut. He runs a hand round the inside of the mortar in the dark to be sure it is clean, because that habit was put into him in his first winter, and it will stay in his hands for the rest of his life. And then he stands for a moment in a dark shop full of jars, in a lane where every other shop has just closed its shutters too, and the city goes quiet around him. That is where we will leave him. We have been a long way tonight, and all of it inside one narrow building on one narrow street. We began in the dark before dawn with a broom and a cold floor, and we have gone through the shutters and the sign, the great bell metal mortar, 200 drawers with Latin on their faces, the leech jar, the morning customers, the physician's bill, the grains and scruples and drams, the still room and its slow fire, the pill bench and the plaster board, the master's table, the lanes and the deliveries, the herb women and the summer gathering days, the mistakes and the searchers and the runaways, the plague year and the fire, and finally a panelled room by the river where a young man read a piece of bad handwriting aloud and was told he had done enough. There is nothing here to remember. Not one of the weights, not one of the Latin words, not a single remedy. If you drifted off somewhere among the drawers and have only just surfaced, that is exactly right, and there is nothing at all to have missed. The shop is dark now. The fire in the back room has gone down to embers under its ash, banked to be found again in the morning. The jars stand where they have always stood, catching what little light comes through the shutter gaps from the lane. The mortar is clean and cold, and it will not sound again until someone lifts the pestle a few hours from now. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw loosen. Let the whole of the day you have had go somewhere else for a while. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back soon with another quiet chapter. Somewhere out beyond the shutters the lane has emptied. The last of the signs has stopped creaking on its bracket, and the long night settles over a street of shops full of dried flowers and sealed jars and slow, patient, sleeping things. Good night.